Before the gods, before men, before even the stars, there was only chaos. Not chaos as we think of it, not noise, not confusion, but an empty vastness, a silent void without shape, without time. From this still, unformed nothingness, the first things came into being, not birthed by a mother or father, but simply emerging as if the universe exhaled. Gaia, the earth, rose firm and wide beneath the blank sky. Tartarus, the deep pit beneath all things, yawned into existence below. Erebus, the darkness, and Nyx, the night, seeped into the cracks of the world. And from Nyx came children born not of light, but of shadow. Hypnos, the sleep that gently closes eyes, and Thanatos, the death that does not ask permission. Gaia, alone but strong, gave rise to Uranus, the sky, to cover her. He stretched himself over her like a blanket of stars, vast and cold. Together they created the first generation of gods, the Titans, beings of immense strength and timeless purpose. Oceanus, who encircled the world in water, Hyperion, who bore the sun, Coeus, Creus, Iapetus, and Themis, each born with dominion over a principle of nature or law. Among them were Cronus, youngest and most cunning, and Rhea, his sister and future queen. Gaia and Uranus also brought forth monsters, the 100-handed Hecatoncheires and the one-eyed Cyclopes, children so fearsome Uranus could not bear the sight of them. He stuffed them back into Gaia's womb, into the earth, causing her pain deeper than any wound. Gaia, betrayed and burdened, sought revenge. She forged a sickle of flint and gave it to her son, Cronus, whispering promises of kingship. Cronus lay in wait until Uranus descended to embrace the earth, and then, without hesitation, he struck. The sky bled. From Uranus's severed flesh, strange children were born. The Furies who punish crimes, the giants who would challenge the gods, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love, rising from sea foam. With Uranus defeated, Cronus took the throne and made Rhea his queen. He ruled the cosmos, but he ruled it with fear. He had seen what a child could do to a father, and he would not be caught off guard. So when Rhea bore him children, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, he swallowed each one whole the moment they drew breath. Rhea, broken by grief, sought help from Gaia, and when her final child was born, she hid the infant on the island of Crete. She wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and gave it to Cronus, who devoured it without question. The hidden child would grow in silence, raised in secret by nymphs and beasts, learning not just strength but cunning. His name was Zeus, and the world had not yet seen what that name would come to mean. On the hidden island of Crete, nestled among caves and watched by the quiet rustling of nymphs and dryads, a child was raised in secret. His name was Zeus, and though he was born of Titans, he would become something far greater. Rhea, his mother, had placed him there not out of whimsy, but out of desperation, a final hope against the tyranny of Cronus. As Zeus grew, the mountains became his guardians, the goats his wet nurses, and the clang of shield against shield by his protectors masked his cries from Cronus's ever-searching ears. The world spun under the rule of a fearful king, and every cry of lightning in the distance hinted at a future his father dreaded. Zeus grew not just in strength, but in understanding, and in the deep crevices of the earth, he began to know the voices of those who had been silenced long before he was born. When Zeus came of age, he did not storm the heavens in fury or raise an army of rebellion overnight. His revolt began with a cup. Disguised and clever, he infiltrated Cronus's court and served him a potion, crafted with the help of Gaia and the goddess Metis, that forced the Titan king to disgorge what he had stolen. First a stone, then Hestia, then Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, each reborn as if time had paused their youth. His siblings, grateful and raw with the injustice of their imprisonment, stood with Zeus, And so began the Great War, the Titanomachy. 10 years of endless, sky-shaking conflict that split the cosmos in its wake. The Titans, led by Cronus, fortified the old ways, anchoring their fight in mountains and tradition. But the younger gods, the Olympians, fought with vision, chaos, and fury. The war tore through the bones of the earth. Trees were uprooted to serve as weapons. Rivers reversed their course. Fire met lightning in midair as the very elements seemed to choose sides. For a time, the battle stood still, with neither gaining ground. But Zeus understood something the Titans did not: the power of the Forsaken. Deep within Tartarus, the Hecatoncheires and Cyclopes remained imprisoned, children of Uranus and Gaia, forgotten by Cronus, feared by all. Zeus descended into that pit not as a god, but as a voice of vengeance. He freed them not with chains, but with promises. The Cyclopes, grateful, forged gifts: thunder and lightning for Zeus, a trident for Poseidon, and a helm of darkness for Hades. The Hecatoncheires, with their 100 arms, became a storm of fists and stone. With these allies, the Olympians gained momentum. Poseidon shook the earth from its very foundations. Hades rose unseen, sowing panic from the shadows. And Zeus, high above all, hurled thunderbolts that split mountains like kindling. Cronus fought with desperation, but he had already lost the future. One by one, the Titans fell. Some fled, some begged. Most were cast into Tartarus, bound by chains so strong that time itself seemed reluctant to pass. Only a few were spared: Prometheus for his wisdom, Epimetheus for his simplicity, and a handful of others whose roles were not yet finished. The war ended not with a coronation, but with a silence that stretched across the sky like a held breath. Zeus, now king of gods, did not build a new world with brute force. He divided the cosmos among his brothers. To Poseidon he gave the sea, deep and restless. To Hades the underworld, silent and absolute. The sky, vast and commanding, he kept for himself. Together they established a new order atop Mount Olympus, a seat of divine power and fragile politics. But peace is not the natural state of power. Beneath the laughter of new gods, old grudges festered. The earth still groaned from the wounds of war. And Zeus, for all his strength, knew that kingship was not the same as peace. It was a crown made of storm clouds. When the smoke of war faded and the Titans lay bound in the dark belly of the earth, there remained a question that no bolt of lightning could answer. What now? Zeus and his siblings stood at the edge of a world that had been broken to be remade. But power was only the beginning of rule, not its reward. They climbed the heights of Mount Olympus, not as conquerors parading in triumph, but as weary victors carrying the weight of a 1,000-year storm. Olympus, with its peaks above the clouds, became their throne and their shelter, their fortress and their theater. From this sacred perch, the Olympians shaped a new age, not just of dominion over mortals, but of divine drama, rivalries, betrayals, and love affairs that would echo louder than thunder. The Titans had ruled with silence and fear, but the Olympians would be louder, more vivid, more human in their grandeur. Zeus took his place as king, not because he was the oldest or the wisest or the kindest, but because he had been the storm that broke the chains. With his crown of thunder and voice like rolling sky, he kept order not by decree alone, but by balancing love and fear in delicate measure. Beside him stood Hera, his sister and queen, regal and sharp, goddess of marriage and family, yet bound herself in a union stitched together more by politics than peace. Their marriage, like Olympus itself, was grand and uneasy, full of splendor and tension, of loyalty tested by jealousy. Hera, though betrayed by Zeus time and again, never left her place, never allowed her fury to become exile. Instead, she watched, she planned. She remembered every insult, every rival, every slight. And Olympus learned quickly that to cross her was to awaken storms more subtle than Zeus's lightning. Poseidon ruled the seas with a trident and a temper to match their tides. He was both generous and vengeful, as unpredictable as the ocean itself. Sailors would pray to him with one breath and curse him the next, and he would answer both with equal indifference. In the depths of the sea, he built palaces of coral and pearl, but his heart longed for the land and skies he had ceded to his brother. He bore children with mortals and nymphs alike, some monstrous, some divine, and each time a wave crashed without warning, somewhere Poseidon was speaking. Meanwhile, Hades took his helm of invisibility and descended into the underworld, not as punishment, but as necessity. He ruled the realm of the dead not with cruelty, but with quiet certainty, tending to souls like a shepherd tends to sheep that never leave the pen. Though he had no throne among the clouds, his authority was absolute, and his name was spoken in whispers, rarely with joy. Other gods rose to Olympus, not born of war, but of lineage and mystery. Athena, daughter of Zeus alone, sprang fully formed from his forehead after he swallowed Metis, her mother, to prevent a prophecy that she would bear a child more powerful than he. Athena emerged clad in armor, wise beyond words, goddess of war and wisdom, of strategy and justice. She was never a child, never helpless, and her presence brought a new order, the kind that drew lines on maps and in laws. Apollo and Artemis, twin children of Zeus and the Titaness Leto, became the sun and the moon in spirit, if not in fact. Apollo shone with music, prophecy, and light, while Artemis guarded the wilds, a virgin huntress with silver arrows and no tolerance for fools. Ares, son of Zeus and Hera, burned with the raw heat of war, unrefined and often unwanted, even among the gods. Where Athena led armies, Ares led carnage, and though mortals worshipped him, Olympus rarely welcomed him. Then came Hephaestus, god of the forge, thrown from Olympus as a child because of his deformity, yet returned as a master of craft, shaping weapons and wonders from fire and metal. His hands built the tools of gods, and though he limped, his art never faltered. His wife Aphrodite, goddess of beauty and desire, was born not of womb, but of sea foam and blood, rising from the ocean as a vision of irresistible longing. Though wed to Hephaestus, she loved freely, drawing the eyes of gods and mortals alike, most famously Ares, with whom she shared both passion and betrayal. Hermes, the messenger, wore sandals with wings and a tongue just as quick. He moved between realms with ease, guiding souls to the underworld, delivering messages with sly smiles, and stealing with charms so smooth that even his victims laughed. Dionysus, the last to rise, brought wine and madness, his arrival contested yet ultimately accepted, for even Olympus could not ignore the god of ecstasy and loss. Together they formed a pantheon like no other, a family of immortals that felt, quarreled, and dreamed in ways that mirrored the mortals below. Their lives were entangled not only with one another, but with the fates of men, whom they watched, tested, cursed, and occasionally loved. Olympus was not a place of harmony, but of balance, of opposites constantly pushing and pulling against each other. Power did not rest easily, and peace was a guest, not a resident. And yet, for all its flaws, Olympus stood, not merely above the earth, but within every story that would be told thereafter. It was the stage upon which every myth would unfold, the source from which every triumph and tragedy would flow. And in that place, among gods and echoes of titans, the true age of myth began. Long before mortals sang the names of Zeus or prayed beneath the marble shadows of temples, there was Prometheus. A titan, yes, but not like the rest. He did not bear the weight of the sky, nor did he hurl mountains in war. He was a thinker, a builder of ideas, a quiet architect of potential. When the Titanomachy ended and the old gods were cast down, Prometheus had chosen the side of Olympus, not out of fear, but because he believed in change. For his loyalty, Zeus allowed him to roam free, to shape the new world alongside the victorious gods. But Prometheus did not gaze upward at the thrones atop Olympus. He looked downward, at the dirt, the sea, the mountain valleys, and imagined what might walk there, what might speak, what might dream. From clay and river water, Prometheus shaped humanity. He molded their limbs and lifted their chins toward the sky. But the first men were frail, cold, and blind in the darkness of the world. Zeus had forbidden fire to be given to mortals, fearing it would make them too bold, too clever, too near to gods. Without fire, they were shadows, huddled, frightened, voiceless. Prometheus watched their suffering, their fingers bleeding from cold, their stomachs hollow, their nights endless. He saw their hunger not just for food, but for meaning. And so one night, when the stars turned their faces, he stole flame from the chariot of the sun, a single tongue of light cradled in a hollow fennel stalk, and carried it to the world below. With fire came everything. Warmth, yes, but also craft. The shaping of metal, the baking of bread, the light that pushed back shadows, both real and imagined. With fire came story, myth, memory. Humanity stirred. It grew. And Zeus, watching from above, did not see gratitude. He saw defiance. To him, fire was divine, and Prometheus had breached the boundary that separated God from man. He did not rage like Poseidon or send plagues like Apollo. No, Zeus punished with precision. First, he summoned Hephaestus to sculpt a new being, one more beautiful than Aphrodite, more clever than Hermes, more alluring than any nymph. Her name was Pandora, and she was crafted not for companionship, but for calamity. Pandora was given a jar, a gift and a curse, and sent down to live among men. Her curiosity was not a flaw, but a design. She opened the jar, and from it poured every sorrow, pain, sickness, war, jealousy, death. The world groaned under the weight of her curiosity. Only one thing remained trapped at the bottom: hope. Some say she let it out too. Others say it still waits there, trembling. And as mankind suffered, Zeus turned his gaze back to Prometheus. For the crime of giving mortals fire, he was taken in chains and carried beyond the edge of the earth, to the crags of the Caucasus Mountains. There, Hephaestus bound him to the rock, not with ropes, but with unbreakable iron and divine silence. Each day an eagle, the emblem of Zeus, came to feed upon his liver, and each night his flesh grew back, ready for the torment to begin again. He did not scream, he did not beg, he endured, for he had chosen not the gods, but the future. And though his pain was eternal, his gift had sparked something that could not be undone. It would be generations before Heracles, son of Zeus, passed by and broke the chains. But even then, the scar remained, not just on the Titan skin, but on Olympus itself. Prometheus had shown that rebellion did not always come with swords. Sometimes it came with flame. And so humanity continued, fragile and flawed, but never again helpless. They now had fire, and with it, the tools to build, to fight, to ask questions the gods would not always answer. In the halls of Olympus, the gods watched, some with amusement, some with suspicion. For the first time, the line between divine and mortal had blurred. And though Zeus still held the throne, he had learned something dangerous: that the most powerful enemy of the gods was not a titan or a beast. It was a mind that dared to dream. As the age of fire gave way to the age of cities, men spread across the earth with fire in their hands and pride in their hearts. They built altars, carved laws, tilled the soil, and raised their voices in praise and complaint alike. Yet with each passing generation, the distance between gods and men grew greater, not because Olympus had withdrawn, but because humanity, now warm and bold, began to forget who had given them the spark. The old reverence faded. The temples grew loud with flattery, but quiet with sincerity. And in their forgetfulness, men became reckless. They cheated and stole, cursed the gods when storms struck, and praised only themselves when the harvest was good. Olympus watched not with rage, but with a growing, bitter disappointment. Zeus, who had once hidden fire from mankind out of fear for what they might become, now saw what they had become with it. Where once he had punished one titan for lifting man too high, now he considered punishing all of mankind for dragging divinity so low. The gods gathered in solemn judgment. Poseidon spoke of seas fouled with waste. Artemis spoke of forests hunted bare. Demeter spoke of offerings rotting on her altars while men dined like kings. Even Hera, so often cold toward mortals, agreed. The world had grown rotten at its roots. So Zeus, not with a scream but a sigh, made a decision. He would not scorch the earth with fire. He would wash it clean with water. The rains did not come as a warning. They fell with no mercy, no message, just the long, unbroken cry of the sky tearing itself open. Rivers swelled and devoured their banks. Fields vanished beneath rising tides. Mountains became islands. Cities vanished without a sound. The sea climbed hills that had never known salt. And the gods did not intervene, for this was not a punishment. It was a reset. But not all mortals had abandoned virtue. There was one man, Deucalion, son of Prometheus, who still honored the old ways. He and his wife Pyrrha, daughter of Epimetheus and Pandora, lived with simplicity, prayed with sincerity, and asked for nothing but truth. Prometheus, ever watchful from his place of torment, warned his son. And so, with quiet resolve, Deucalion built a chest, not grand like Noah's Ark in later tales, but sturdy and sealed. When the flood came, they climbed inside, holding each other through the soundless chaos. For 9 days and nights, the world was only water. Olympus stood untouched above the clouds, but the earth below was empty, quiet, and new. At last, the rain stopped. The chest came to rest atop Mount Parnassus, and Deucalion and Pyrrha stepped into a world that no longer remembered their names. There were no birds, no smoke, no footprints but their own. They wept, not for the drowned, but for the silence. What is mankind, they asked, if it must begin again with only two? They prayed not for power or victory, but for guidance. And the gods, moved by humility, answered, not with thunder, but through the voice of the oracle of Themis. The message was strange. Cover your heads, she said, and throw the bones of your mother behind you. Confused but obedient, they pondered the riddle. Mother must be the earth, they reasoned, and her bones, stones. So they gathered rocks, covered their heads with cloth, and cast the stones behind them as they walked. And as each stone struck the ground, it softened, it lengthened, it took shape. From Deucalion stones came men, from Pyrrha's, women, and thus a new race of mortals rose, not born of wombs, but of sorrow, hope, and the will to begin again. These people, born from stone, were stronger and wiser than those before them. They carried in their bones the memory of flood and silence. They built not just cities, but stories. They remembered the gods not only in fear, but in gratitude. For a time, balance returned. The gods stepped back once more, watching with tempered hope. And though the world would stumble again, and men would forget again, the tale of the flood endured, a whisper in every crashing wave, a warning behind every storm cloud. Deucalion and Pyrrha lived long lives, not as kings and queens, but as reminders that what is destroyed can be rebuilt, that what is lost can be mourned and remade, that even when the gods give up on the world may still find a way back to the gods. Before the world knew him as a god, before temples were carved in his name and stars were strung into the sky to trace his legend, Heracles was simply a boy named Alcides. He was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman named Alcmene. Born in Thebes under a sky heavy with prophecy and jealousy, Hera, the queen of Olympus, knew of the child long before he took his first breath, and her fury shaped his fate. Though Zeus had many children beyond their marriage, it was Heracles who carried the mark of destiny, and thus he was the one Hera chose to curse most deeply. Even in his cradle, she sent serpents to strangle him in his sleep, but the infant crushed them with his bare hands, his grip as calm as it was final. As he grew, Heracles became a symbol of strength. Not just brute force, but will, the kind of will that breaks chains and bends iron. He trained in every art, music, archery, swordsmanship, wrestling. But for all his power, he was not born with peace. Hera's hatred followed him like a shadow. One day in a madness she conjured, he did the unthinkable. He killed his wife and children with his own hands, unaware of their identities until the blood dried. When he awoke to the truth, grief hollowed him. He sought penance not through prayers but through trial. The Oracle of Delphi, under Hera's unseen guidance, sent him to serve King Eurystheus of Tyrants. His punishment would be to complete 10 labors. Tasks so impossible, they would either break him or cleanse him. Later, they would become 12. The first labor was the slaying of the Nemean lion, a beast whose golden hide could not be pierced by weapon. Heracles, unable to wound it with sword or arrow, cornered it in its cave and strangled it with his arms. He skinned the lion using its own claws and wore its pelt as armor, its head as a hood, becoming a figure both terrifying and iconic. His second trial led him to the swamps of Lerna, where the Hydra, a serpent with 9 heads, awaited. For every head he cut, 2 grew back. With the help of his nephew Iolaus, he seared each neck to prevent its regrowth. When he buried the immortal head beneath a stone, even the earth seemed to breathe easier. His next task took him across the known world. He captured the golden hind of Artemis without harming it, appeasing the goddess with humility. He trapped the Erymanthian boar and brought it back alive, laughing as Eurystheus cowered in a jar at the sight. He cleaned the Augean stables in a single day, not by scrubbing, but by rerouting 2 rivers through them. A solution as clever as it was devastating. He chased away the man-eating Stymphalian birds with a rattle forged by Hephaestus, their metallic wings clattering into the distance like a broken storm. He subdued the Cretan bull, tamed the flesh-eating mares of Diomedes, and stole the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. Though what began as negotiation ended in battle, twisted again by Hera's hand. In his 10th labor, he traveled to the edge of the world to steal the cattle of the giant Geryon, slaying the 3-bodied guardian and driving the herd back through lands plagued with obstacles and ambushes. But 2 of his labors were disqualified. The Hydra, because Iolaus helped. The stables, because he was paid. So 2 more were added. The first brought him to the Garden of the Hesperides, where golden apples hung from branches guarded by a 100-headed dragon named Ladon. He did not fight. Instead, he sought out Atlas, the titan who held up the sky. Heracles offered to take the heavens upon his shoulders so Atlas could fetch the apples. When Atlas returned, he tried to leave Heracles with the burden, but the hero, with cunning masked as politeness, tricked him into taking it back. The final labor was the darkest, to descend into the underworld and bring back Cerberus, the 3-headed hound who guarded the gates of the dead. Hades allowed it on one condition: no weapons. Heracles wrestled the beast with his bare hands and dragged it, snarling and snapping, into the daylight. With this, his atonement was complete. He had faced monsters, gods, the dead, and himself. Yet Heracles was never at peace. His labors made him famous, but they did not make him whole. His strength was unmatched, but his soul remained restless. He wandered, fought in wars, loved many, lost more. Hera never ceased her torment, and fate never softened its grip. In the end, his death came not from battle, but from betrayal. a poisoned robe given by his wife, unknowingly soaked in the blood of a dying centaur. It burned his skin, melted his flesh, and no river could soothe the agony. Knowing death was near, Heracles built his own funeral pyre and lay upon it. As the flames rose, the gods intervened. Zeus, moved by the endurance of his son, lifted his soul to Olympus. There Heracles became not just a hero, but a god. He joined the immortals, took his place among the stars, and even Hera finally let her hatred cool. She gave him her daughter, Hebe, in marriage, not as surrender, but as a strange kind of peace. And so the man who once bore the heavens on his back was given a seat beside them, not because he was flawless, but because he was more than flesh, a myth carved from guilt, strength, and redemption. His story endured not for the monsters he slew, but for the weight he carried long after the blood was washed away. There are many ways a kingdom is born, but few begin with flowers. Persephone, daughter of Demeter and Zeus, was not raised in the halls of Olympus, but among meadows and hillsides, where the air tasted of spring and the soil remembered every step she took. She was a maiden of laughter and curiosity, her fingers forever stained with petals and pollen, her gaze reaching toward the horizon rather than the heavens. Demeter, goddess of harvest and growth, loved her with a fierceness that even Zeus did not challenge. She shielded her daughter from gods and men alike, for in Persephone she saw not just beauty, but balance, a child untouched by pain, unclaimed by fate. But the earth is not only surface, it has depth. And one day the ground opened its mouth. Hades, god of the underworld, watched the world in silence. He did not seek glory like his brothers, nor did he raise storms or spawn empires. His was a realm of stillness, of shadows and endings. But in that stillness grew a yearning, not for conquest, but for companionship. When he saw Persephone dancing among the narcissus, he did not ask. The earth cracked, and his chariot rose. In an instant, she was gone. The field closed. The sky remained blue. The birds still sang. But Demeter felt the absence like a snapped stem. Her daughter was missing, and no answer satisfied the ache. So began her wandering. Demeter left Olympus in silence. She abandoned her temples and let the fields grow fallow. Grains withered, and hunger crept across the land. Mortals, once nourished by her grace, starved beneath cloudless skies. The gods pleaded, but Demeter heard only the rustle of dead leaves. Zeus, torn between his brother and the balance of the world, sent Hermes as a messenger to the underworld. There, in halls carved from bone and shadow, Persephone sat beside Hades, not weeping, not smiling, simply changed. Hades had not treated her cruelly. He had offered her a throne, not chains. He had crowned her queen of the dead, not a prisoner, and yet she had not chosen. When Hermes arrived, Hades agreed to let her return. But one truth bound the underworld. Those who ate of its food must remain. Persephone had eaten 6 seeds of a pomegranate, small, crimson, bittersweet, and so a compromise was born. For 6 months of the year, she would walk the world above, and for 6 she would reign below. She returned to Demeter with spring at her heels. Flowers burst from dead soil, crops awakened. But when autumn came, the earth chilled, the leaves browned, and Persephone vanished into shadow once more. Thus the seasons were born, not from the tilt of the planet, but from the rhythm of a mother's grief and a daughter's duty. Persephone, once a maiden of bloom, became a goddess of thresholds, of beginnings and endings, of life and what lies beyond. She was no longer just a child. She became something else entirely, a queen with 2 faces, 2 realms, 2 hearts. Mortals feared Hades, but they prayed to Persephone. They whispered her name in burial rites, placed seeds in tombs, and asked that she guide them gently when their time came. In her, they saw not just death, but passage. Her story is not of abduction alone, nor of rescue. It is the tale of how even gods can be changed by choice, and how a girl who walked through darkness came to wear it as a crown. She did not rage like Hera or strike like Artemis. She ruled with quiet presence, with patience that stretched beyond time. And the world in its turning remembered her rhythm. Every spring she returns, not as the girl who was taken, but as the goddess who chose to come back. Before war was worshipped and heroes carved their names into stone, there was a man whose power lay not in strength, but in sound. His name was Orpheus, son of the muse Calliope, and either a king or a god, depending on who told the story. But all agreed on one thing. When Orpheus played his lyre, the world listened. Trees bent closer, rivers paused. Even wild beasts tamed their breath. His music was not entertainment. It was memory made audible. It echoed the ache of the stars and the longing of things not yet born. And so it was only natural that love found him in the form of Eurydice, a woman not described in songs for her beauty, but remembered for how he sang of her. They married in fields strung with sunlight and flowers, a joy so deep it startled even the gods. But happiness, in myth, rarely lingers. On that same day, Eurydice wandered among the grass, and a serpent bit her heel. She died before the sun had fully set, her laughter still caught in the folds of her wedding gown. Orpheus, shattered, did not scream. He did not plead with Zeus or burn offerings at temples. He took his lyre and walked to the gates of the underworld, past the shadows, past the warnings, and into the place no living soul was meant to tread. He did not come with sword or spell, but with song. As he played, the realm of the dead changed. Cerberus lay down his 3 heads and slept. The Furies, who weep blood and torment oath-breakers, closed their eyes. Even Hades and Persephone paused. Orpheus sang not of triumph, but of loss, not of glory, but of absence. He reminded them of what it was to love and to grieve. And in that stillness, the king and queen of the dead did something they rarely did. They agreed to let someone go. Eurydice could return, they said, but only if Orpheus walked ahead and never looked back until they both stood under the sun. He agreed without question. He turned and walked, his feet echoing in the silence, his heart louder than his steps. Behind him, Eurydice followed, not with breath or voice, but with presence. He could not hear her. He could not touch her. He could only believe. And belief, even for the faithful, is a fragile thing. As the final steps approached, as the first warmth of the upper world touched his skin, doubt whispered, what if the gods had tricked him? What if she wasn't really there? What if he had lost her again and didn't know? And so he turned. In that instant, she was there, her eyes, her face, her mouth half formed in a smile. And then she wasn't. The underworld does not offer second chances. She faded like a sigh, and her last glance was not of anger, but of infinite sadness. Orpheus reached, but air does not hold memory. He cried out, but echoes do not console. He tried to return, but no music could open the gates a second time. The gods are many things, but they are consistent in their terms. Orpheus wandered the earth after that, hollow and unshaven, singing songs that bent the hearts of even the cruelest kings. He rejected the company of women, not out of bitterness, but out of loyalty. Some say this angered the Maenads, wild followers of Dionysus, who tore him limb from limb in a frenzy. Others say he simply faded, returning to the earth like mist. But wherever he went, his lyre was cast into the stars, and his songs remained. Not written, but remembered. Not sung aloud, but felt. His story was not one of failure, but of fragility. The gods had given him a path, and he had almost succeeded. Yet in that final moment, his humanity, his love, his fear, his doubt, cost him everything. And perhaps that is why we remember him. Not because he triumphed, but because he tried. because he risked everything not for glory, but for love. And because even now, in moments of silence, his melody lingers, a whisper that reminds us that faith requires the courage not to look back. Long before she was a monster, Medusa was a woman. She was not born with snakes for hair or eyes that turned men to stone. She was born mortal, the only one among the three Gorgon sisters. Her beauty was whispered in the halls of temples, not for its extravagance, but for its purity. She was devoted to Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, and served as a priestess in her temple. There in stone chambers filled with quiet incense and pale light, she gave her days to prayer and ritual. Her vows were sacred, her silence was sacred. But in a world ruled by gods, sanctity is no shield. Poseidon, lord of the sea, saw her. Whether it was desire or conquest that stirred in him, no one can say. What is known is that he came to her not in courtship, but in power. And he did not seek her in a garden or hall, but in the temple of Athena itself, a place meant to be untouchable. What happened there is often softened in later tellings, but the truth lingers between the lines. Medusa was not a willing partner. Her cries were unheard by the gods above, or perhaps ignored. When it was over, she was not comforted. She was not protected. She was punished. Athena, goddess of justice and wisdom, arrived to find her temple defiled. And though Medusa was the victim, it was she who bore the sentence. Perhaps Athena's wrath was aimed at Poseidon, but landed on Medusa. Perhaps the goddess saw not violation, but weakness. Or perhaps in the cold balance of divine pride, no mortal was worth defending. Whatever the reason, the curse came swiftly. Her hair, once admired, became a nest of serpents. Her gaze, once soft, turned deadly. No man could meet her eyes and live. She fled to the ends of the earth, where stone cliffs met restless waves, and there she lived. Not in rage, but in exile. Over time, Medusa's name became a warning, her face a symbol of terror. Stories were told of her slaying knights with a glance, of her lair filled with statues of the foolish and the brave. But the truth beneath the myth was quieter. She lived alone, far from temples and towns. Her solitude was not chosen, but enforced. She was a reminder, not of evil, but of what the gods would not atone for. And yet, as often happens in myth, her name did not fade, for heroes need monsters. And Perseus, son of Zeus and a mortal woman, was told he could not become great until he faced her. Sent by King Polydectes under the guise of a noble quest, Perseus sought Medusa not out of justice, but obedience. He was given aid by the gods, a mirrored shield from Athena, winged sandals from Hermes, and a blade sharp enough to cut what should not be cut. He found her sleeping. Her sisters stirred nearby. But it was Medusa he sought. Using the shield to avoid her gaze, he approached in silence and struck. Her head was severed in one blow. Her body fell, and from her blood sprang two children, Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a giant with a golden sword. Her story did not end in death. It began a new myth the moment she could no longer speak. Perseus carried her head as a trophy, not knowing that it retained its power. He used it to turn enemies to stone, to win battles, to impress gods and kings. But what he carried was more than a weapon. It was the silence of a woman wronged, the weight of a curse mistaken for evil. Even Athena, who once punished her, placed Medusa's face on her shield, not as a mockery, but as protection. In that strange gesture, perhaps there was regret. Or perhaps even gods must borrow the strength of those they have broken. Medusa became more than myth. She became a symbol, not just of fear, but of fury. A reflection of how beauty can be punished, how victimhood can be erased, and how stories told by victors often leave out the weeping. In the end, she was not a monster. She was made one. And though her name still echoes through tales of terror, her truth waits beneath the surface, like stone beneath ivy, like pain beneath silence. In the golden age before war had scorched the name of Troy into the minds of poets, there was a wedding, divine, radiant, and doomed from the first toast. Peleus, a mortal king, was to wed Thetis, a sea nymph whose beauty rivaled the stars. All the gods were invited, all but one. Eris, goddess of strife, was not welcome at celebrations, and from that insult, history shifted. She arrived uninvited, quiet, and smiling in a way only mischief knows. In her hand, a golden apple gleamed, inscribed with 3 words that needed no explanation: "To the fairest." Then she tossed it into the crowd and vanished. The apple landed among 3 goddesses, each radiant in her own right: Hera, queen of Olympus; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Each claimed the apple. None would yield. Their quarrel shook Olympus with tension more dangerous than battle. And so Zeus, knowing better than to choose among them, cast the responsibility downward. The judge would not be a god, but a man. He chose Paris, prince of Troy, known not for war or wit, but for fairness and beauty. He lived not in palace halls, but among sheep in quiet hills, unaware that his name would one day be cursed by kings. Hermes led the 3 goddesses to Mount Ida, where Paris tended flocks. When they appeared before him, glowing with divinity, he bowed but said nothing. For how does a mortal compare the moon, the sea, and the sun? Each goddess offered not just beauty, but a bribe. Hera promised power, to make him lord over all Asia. Athena offered wisdom and victory in all battles. But Aphrodite came closer and whispered of love. She offered him the heart of the most beautiful mortal woman alive, Helen of Sparta. And Paris, young and full of dreams, not yet broken by consequence, placed the apple in her hands. It was a simple choice, but its echo would become thunder. Aphrodite smiled. Hera seethed. Athena turned cold. And from that moment, the fate of Troy unraveled. For Helen, already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta, was not a prize to be given. She was a spark, one that would light 10 years of war. Paris traveled to Sparta, clothed in charm and crowned by prophecy. Whether he seduced Helen or whether she followed him willingly, stories differ, but she left with him. And Greece, wounded in pride and honor, rose in wrath. Agamemnon, brother of Menelaus and king of kings, gathered the Greek armies. Odysseus left Ithaca. Achilles stepped into destiny. Ships filled the horizon like clouds before a storm. And all of it, the rage of warriors, the fall of empires, the death of heroes, traced back to a single apple tossed in spite, and a young shepherd who did not understand the cost of beauty. Paris returned to Troy with Helen, but peace did not follow. His city, proud and ancient, opened its gates to her, believing it had welcomed love. In truth, it had invited fate. The judgment of Paris was not about who was fairest. It was about what men choose when offered the world. Power, wisdom, or love, each a mirror, each a snare. Paris chose love, or at least the illusion of it. And from that choice came war, not just of swords and shields, but of gods who took sides and bent the rules of nature to protect their favorites. The gods no longer stood distant. They waded into blood and bronze. They whispered in dreams and clouded the eyes of kings. And beneath it all, Helen stood silent. Not a seductress, but a woman torn between being a symbol and a person. The war had not yet begun, but the stage was set. The ships were being built, the omens were taking shape, and the gods, once merely worshipped, were about to become players in the greatest tragedy of the age. The apple had been claimed, the prize had been stolen, and history, once drifting like a leaf, was now a river rushing toward fire. Troy stood with walls that seemed to defy time itself. Walls built not by mortal hands alone, but by gods and kings bound in ancient bargains. Poseidon and Apollo, once punished by Zeus, had walked the earth as builders in disguise, raising stone upon stone with immortal precision. The city they left behind was a marvel, its towers kissed by the sun and its gates too thick for any battering ram. Inside its walls, generations had thrived: merchants, soldiers, priests, and poets, all under the gaze of King Priam, who ruled not with tyranny, but with the weary wisdom of age. Yet no city, no matter how fortified, could resist a curse wrapped in prophecy and pride, and no wall, no matter how divine, could withstand betrayal from within. The war, when it finally came, did not arrive like a wave, but like a long, slow winter. The Greeks landed with 1,000 ships, each filled with bronze, ambition, and gods whispering in armor. The siege lasted 10 years. 10 years of blood, of heroes rising and falling like stars in battle. Achilles, son of Thetis, burned brighter than them all. He fought with a rage that was almost divine, slaying Hector, Troy's greatest prince, and dragging his body around the walls. Yet even Achilles, blessed and terrible, fell to fate, pierced in the heel by Paris, guided by Apollo's hand. And as his body burned on the shores, the war began to turn, not through strength, but through cunning. Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, saw what brute force could not win. Troy had resisted every assault, every deception, every curse. But even the proud grow tired. Even kings make mistakes when they believe the gods have grown quiet. And so the Greeks built a horse, vast, hollow, beautiful, a gift to the gods, or so they claimed. They burned their camps, sailed away, and left behind only the horse, standing silent at the gates like a statue of surrender. The Trojans, weary of battle and drunk on the scent of victory, debated. Some warned it was a trick. Laocoon, priest of Poseidon, cried out that Greeks bear gifts, even when they pretend to flee. But as if to silence him, serpents rose from the sea and crushed him before the crowd, a sign the people misread. The horse was brought inside. That night, as Troy celebrated with songs and wine, the soldiers hidden within the belly of the beast crept out. They opened the gates. The Greek army, which had only pretended to retreat, returned under cover of darkness. And the city, once blessed by gods, burned. Fires licked the sky. Temples crumbled. Blood ran through the streets like spilled oil. Priam was struck down before the altar. Hecuba screamed into the smoke. Cassandra, cursed to see truth but never be believed, was dragged from sanctuary. And Helen, the woman whose face had launched it all, stood in the ruins, neither goddess nor prize, only a survivor. The fall of Troy was not just the end of a city, it was the death of an age. The heroes who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with gods were gone or cursed. Odysseus would wander for years, lost in trials and temptations. Menelaus would return to Sparta with Helen, but peace would never fully return to his halls. And Aeneas, cousin of Hector, would flee the ashes with his father on his back and a sword at his side, destined to carry the last flame of Troy westward, toward a future not yet written. The gods, too, changed that night. Some withdrew, disgusted by the carnage. Others rejoiced in the ruin, but none could deny that the world had shifted. Troy's legacy endured not in stone, for its walls were broken, nor in treasure, for its gold was plundered, but in stories, in the poems sung beside fires, in the whispered names of fallen warriors, in the stars where constellations remember their shapes. The Trojan War became a mirror for every war to come, full of honor and horror, bravery and betrayal, gods and ghosts. It taught that love could spark catastrophe, that beauty could be weaponized, and that the clever, not always the just, write the endings. And so Troy fell, not because it deserved to, but because myth demands that nothing perfect can last. When the war ended and Troy burned to embers, most men thought of home. They longed for familiar shores, the sound of children's laughter, the feel of hearthstones beneath tired feet. But for Odysseus, king of Ithaca, Home would remain a horizon never quite reached. Though he had survived the war, though his cunning had ended it, he would find that the wrath of gods was not so easily escaped. His voyage meant to last weeks, stretched into 10 long years, not because the sea was cruel, but because his name still echoed too loudly in Olympus. He had outwitted monsters, bent fates, and dared to question the divine, and for that, Poseidon marked him. His journey began with hope. 12 ships sailed from the shores of Troy, their sails swollen with wind and dreams of return. But storms came quickly. The first stop was Ismarus, where the Cicones lived. Odysseus and his men raided, as warriors often did, but lingered too long. The Cicones fought back, and the Greeks paid in blood. Then came the land of the lotus eaters, where flowers made men forget. 3 of his men ate the petals and smiled with empty eyes, their memories washed away. Odysseus dragged them back to the ship by force, for he knew that forgetting was its own kind of death. But the true nightmare began on the island of the Cyclopes. There, in a cave of stone and bone, they met Polyphemus, a one-eyed giant and son of Poseidon. Odysseus, ever curious, stayed too long. Polyphemus killed and ate several of his men. Odysseus devised a plan, offering the giant wine, telling him his name was Nobody. When Polyphemus slept, they drove a sharpened stake into his eye. As the giant screamed and the others came running, he could only cry, "Nobody has blinded me," and so no help came. Odysseus escaped beneath the bellies of sheep, but as he sailed away, he shouted his real name in pride, and that pride would cost him dearly. For Poseidon heard and Poseidon remembered. More trials followed. Aeolus, keeper of the winds, gave him a bag filled with storms, warning not to open it. But curiosity and mistrust brewed among his crew. As Ithaca came into view, they opened the bag, thinking it gold. The winds escaped, and they were thrown back across the sea. They reached the land of the Laestrygonians, giant cannibals who destroyed all but one ship. They sailed on to Aiaia, home of Circe, the enchantress. She turned his men into pigs, but Hermes aided Odysseus with a magical herb. He resisted her spell, and for a year they remained on her island, not as captives, but as guests lulled by rest and warmth. Yet the call of home never faded. Circe warned him that before returning, he must visit the underworld and speak with the prophet Tiresias. In that realm of shadow, Odysseus met ghosts, of his mother, of fallen warriors, of the unburied and the unforgiven. Tiresias told him the path, but warned of temptation. As he sailed onward, he faced the sirens, whose voices promised truth and joy. Odysseus, bound to the mast, heard their song but could not move, while his crew rode with ears sealed in wax. Then came Scylla and Charybdis, a 6-headed monster and a whirlpool. He lost men to the jaws, but the ship passed. They reached the island of Thrinacia, where Helios kept his sacred cattle. Odysseus warned his men not to touch them, but hunger proved stronger than command. They slaughtered the beasts, and when they set sail again, Zeus struck the ship with lightning. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to wreckage until he washed ashore on Ogygia, the island of Calypso. She was a nymph, beautiful and eternal. She offered him immortality, love, and rest. For 7 years he stayed, caught between longing and forgetting. But the gods, finally swayed by Athena's pleas, ordered his release. Calypso wept, but let him go. And Odysseus, once again adrift, found himself shipwrecked one final time before reaching Phaeacia. There he told his story to the king. Moved by his trials, they gave him a ship, and at last Odysseus returned to Ithaca, not as a king in glory, but as a beggar in disguise. His palace had been overrun with suitors, each vying for the hand of Penelope, his wife. She had waited, weaving by day and undoing by night, refusing to believe he was dead. With the help of his son Telemachus and a few loyal servants, Odysseus revealed himself and slaughtered the suitors. Justice came not with a trial, but with arrows. And so he reclaimed his throne, not with celebration, but with weariness. His journey had changed him. He was home, but the man who had left Ithaca had not returned. He was something older, something more hollow and wise. He had spoken with the dead, seen gods in disguise, resisted pleasure, endured grief, and survived every test fate could conjure. But perhaps the greatest cost was time. The years lost, the silence endured, the joy postponed. And so ends the story of the long road home. Not in triumph, but in understanding. Long before Oedipus spoke his first word, or opened his eyes to the light of Thebes, his fate had already been sealed by the gods and spoken by an oracle. His father, King Laius, had once visited the oracle of Delphi and asked how he might ensure the future of his line. The answer he received was not a promise, but a warning that his own son would kill him and marry his wife. Terrified, Laius returned to Thebes, and when a son was born to him in Queen Jocasta, he acted not as a father, but as a man trying to outrun prophecy. The baby was bound by the ankles and left to die on the slopes of Mount Cithaeron. But fate is patient, and it does not falter when men attempt to avoid it. A shepherd found the infant and, moved by pity, brought him to the court of Corinth, where he was adopted by King Polybus and Queen Merope. They named him Oedipus, meaning swollen foot, for the scars that never quite faded. He grew up never knowing the truth, believing himself a prince by blood, not by chance. But questions stirred in him as he grew, and when a drunken man at a banquet hinted that he was not who he thought he was, Oedipus sought the truth. He too went to Delphi and asked the oracle not of his parentage, but of his destiny. And again the gods answered not with comfort, but with dread. They told him he was fated to kill his father and marry his mother. Horrified, Oedipus fled Corinth, determined never to return, never to harm those he called parents. But the gods do not play games. In trying to escape the future, he ran straight into it. At a crossroads along the way, he encountered an older man in a chariot who refused to move aside. Words turned to anger, anger to violence, and Oedipus struck the man down. He did not know the man was King Laius, his true father. He did not see the prophecy unfolding. He saw only a stranger in his path and a moment where pride won over patience. Continuing on his journey, he reached Thebes, a city under siege, not by armies, but by riddles. A monstrous creature called the Sphinx had perched outside the gates, devouring those who could not solve her puzzle. She asked each traveler a single riddle. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at noon, and 3 in the evening? None had answered correctly. But Oedipus, sharp in mind and bold in speech, answered, Man, who crawls as a baby, walks upright as an adult, and uses a cane in old age. The Sphinx, defeated by truth, threw herself from the cliffs. Thebes, delivered from terror, welcomed its savior with open arms. Oedipus was crowned king and given the widowed Queen Jocasta as his bride. And so the second half of the prophecy came to pass, not with violence, but with celebration. Years passed. Oedipus and Jocasta ruled together and had children. The city prospered. But fate does not forget. A plague struck Thebes, and the people cried out for salvation. The oracle declared that the land was cursed because the murderer of Laius still lived unpunished. Determined to save his city, Oedipus vowed to find the killer. He did not know he was hunting himself. One by one, the layers unraveled. Witnesses were summoned. Servants remembered. And slowly the truth emerged, terrible and clear. The man he had killed at the crossroads was Laius. The woman he had married was Jocasta, his mother. His children were both sons and brothers, daughters and sisters. Jocasta, upon learning the truth, hanged herself in despair. Oedipus, horrified, took her brooches and blinded himself, not as punishment, but as rejection of what he had seen, what he had lived, and what he had unknowingly become. He begged to be exiled from Thebes, and his request was granted. He wandered the land, led by his daughter Antigone, no longer a king but a broken man clinging to the edge of meaning. He had tried to be righteous. He had sought truth. But in a world ruled by prophecy, even virtue could be a weapon turned inward. Oedipus did not die in shame, though. In his final years, he found a strange kind of peace. At Colonus, he was welcomed by King Theseus of Athens, who saw in him not a monster, but a man shaped by forces beyond his control. There, surrounded by trees and silence, Oedipus disappeared, not as a body laid to rest, but as a mystery. The gods took him, or perhaps the earth swallowed him. His grave was never found, but his story was never lost. His life became a mirror for the ancient Greeks, a tale of fate, of hubris, of the limits of knowledge. It asked whether a man can be guilty for what he never meant, whether truth is always kind, and whether destiny can be dodged by will alone. And in that quiet tragedy, in the story of a man who sought to do right and still did wrong, generations found not just sorrow, but reflection. In the quiet shadow left by Oedipus's departure, Thebes did not find peace. His sons, Eteocles and Polynices, born of the same tragedy that blinded their father, could not share power without suspicion. They agreed to alternate rule. 1 year Eteocles would reign, the next Polynices. But trust is a fragile thread in a house tangled by fate. When Eteocles refused to step down at the end of his turn, Polynices did not plead. He went to Argos, gathered allies, and returned with an army. The land their father had once ruled with shaking hands became a battlefield. And as prophesied by blood, both brothers died by each other's sword. Neither victor, both victims. Their bodies fell side by side, but their memories were divided by decree. Creon, uncle to the fallen, now king, declared Eteocles a hero, fit for burial and mourning. But Polynices, he labeled a traitor. His corpse was left in the open air, forbidden the rites that would send his soul to rest. To the people of Thebes, the order was law. To Antigone, daughter of Oedipus, it was a wound against the gods. She believed in honor beyond politics, in family beyond fear. And though her sister Ismene begged her to stay silent, to survive, Antigone walked beneath the moonlight, past guards who looked away, and covered her brother's body with dust. The simplest form of burial, but enough to claim him from disgrace. When word reached Creon, he was furious, not because of the crime, but because it challenged his command. He summoned Antigone, expecting fear, perhaps apology. What he found instead was resolve sharper than his crown. She did not deny what she had done. She spoke of divine laws older than kings, of duties that outlasted thrones. Creon, bound by his own decree and pride, condemned her to death. He ordered that she be sealed in a tomb, buried alive, a punishment veiled as justice. But his son, Haman, who loved Antigone, pleaded for mercy. Creon refused. The seer Tiresias warned of doom if he did not relent. Too late, Creon's certainty began to crack. He went to the tomb to release her, but found only silence. Antigone had taken her own life. Haman, upon seeing her, joined her in death. And when Creon returned home, he found his wife, Eurydice, dead by her own hand as well. Grief multiplied like shadows at dusk, each death echoing the next, until Creon stood alone, a king in title only, mourning not just his family, but his hubris. Antigone's tale became a mirror held to the face of authority. Was she a rebel or a martyr? A daughter acting in defiance, or a soul refusing to let law silence love? The ancient Greeks did not offer easy answers. Her name was remembered not for triumph, but for courage, the kind that stands still while power rages. She did not lift a sword. She did not lead an army. She simply refused to accept that a brother's dignity could be revoked by decree. And in doing so, she reminded even the gods that justice, when wielded without compassion, can become cruelty dressed in law. In temples and in tragedy, Antigone's name lingered like incense, a scent too faint for thunder, but too strong to fade. She was a whisper against tyranny, a thread of moral clarity in a world tangled with divine and mortal commands. Her death did not end her story. It began a question that would echo through generations. When obedience is pitted against conscience, which should bend? And perhaps in the stillness of that sealed tomb, where stone met breath one final time, Antigone answered not with words, but with silence stronger than any king. In the kingdom of Iolcus, a throne sat occupied by a man who had stolen it. Peleus, brother to the rightful king, had seized power, leaving behind whispers and a broken bloodline. But the gods do not forget, and neither do prophecies. One day an oracle warned Peleus to beware the man who came to him, wearing only one sandal. Years passed, and Jason, son of the deposed King Aeson, grew up in hiding, raised by the wise centaur Chiron, in forests where the stars could still be heard. When he came of age, he traveled to Iolcus to reclaim his birthright. On the way, helping an old woman across a river, who was in truth the goddess Hera in disguise, he lost a sandal, and when he entered the court of Peleus, barefoot on one foot, destiny shifted. Peleus, pretending generosity, agreed to give up the throne, but only if Jason could retrieve the golden fleece, a sacred artifact hidden far away in the distant land of Colchis. It was no errand, it was a death sentence wrapped in honor, but Jason accepted. With the help of Hera, he gathered the greatest heroes of Greece, men whose names would echo in myth: Heracles, Orpheus, Castor and Pollux, Atalanta, and many more. Together they built the Argo, a ship blessed by the gods and fitted with a talking prow, carved from the wood of Zeus's sacred oak. And so the Argonauts set sail, not for war or conquest, but for a prize guarded by monsters, kings, and fate itself. Their journey was not a straight line. They faced perils that twisted the sea into a labyrinth. On Lemnos, they were welcomed by women who had killed their husbands and now ruled alone. The Argonauts stayed, lulled by love and comfort, but eventually moved on. At the island of Cyzicus, they were first welcomed, then mistakenly fought the same people by night, killing their own hosts without knowing. Heracles, distracted by the loss of his companion Hylas to nymphs, was left behind when the ship sailed onward. At every turn, their strength was tested not just by beasts, but by sorrow, by missteps, by the weight of unintended consequence. Eventually they reached Colchis, where the fleece hung on a sacred tree, guarded by a sleepless dragon and protected by King Aias. The king agreed to give the fleece if Jason could complete 3 impossible tasks: yoke fire-breathing oxen, sow a field with dragon's teeth, and fight the warriors who rose from the soil. Jason accepted, but he did not face the trial alone. Hera, still aiding him, enlisted the help of Aphrodite, who struck the heart of Aeetes' daughter, Medea. She fell in love with Jason, a love sudden, consuming, and dangerous. A sorceress in her own right, Medea gave him magical ointments to resist fire, spells to tame beasts, and warnings whispered between loyalty and betrayal. Jason succeeded. The oxen roared but obeyed. The warriors rose but turned on one another when he cast a stone into their midst. Still, Aeetes broke his promise, and so Medea helped Jason steal the fleece. She lulled the dragon to sleep with spells older than her father, and together they fled. Jason, the fleece, and Medea, now traitor to her own blood. Aeetes gave chase. To delay him, Medea committed an unthinkable act. She killed her own brother Absyrtus and scattered his pieces in the sea, forcing her father to stop and collect the remains. The Argo sailed on, leaving behind a wake not of glory, but of guilt. Their return was as cursed as their departure. They faced the bronze giant Talos, who guarded the shores of Crete, and only fell when Medea called upon dark magic to make his single vein of ichor spill. When they finally returned to Iolcus, Jason expected triumph, But Peleus still refused to yield. So Medea, ever cunning, tricked his daughters into killing him, claiming she could make him young again through a ritual that involved dismemberment and boiling. When no rebirth came, only death remained. But the people of Iolcus, horrified, turned on them. Jason and Medea fled to Corinth, where time passed and Jason's love began to fade. He betrayed Medea, seeking to marry the daughter of the king of Corinth. And Medea, wounded beyond repair, struck back with a fury no hero could match. She gifted the new bride a cursed dress that burned her alive. Then in a final act of vengeance, she killed her own children, born of Jason, and left him broken in every way a man can be. Jason, once hailed as a leader of legends, ended his days alone. The Argo, his ship of glory, rotted in the harbor, and it was beneath its collapsing hull that he died, crushed by the weight of his past. Jason and the Argonauts were remembered not just for their bravery, but for the thin line between heroism and destruction. Their journey proved that even the greatest quests are haunted by loss, and that the gods do not always reward those they guide. The Golden Fleece was won, but at what cost? In the songs that followed, it was not the treasure that glowed, but the shadows it left behind. Before she was a villain in whispered tales or a tragedy carved into theater, Medea was a princess of Colchis, raised in the shadow of shrines and serpents. Her bloodline traced to Helios, the sun god himself, and with it came power that the priests dared not name. She grew up not on lullabies but on incantations, not on courtly games but in the presence of potions, herbs, and the language of the dead. Her father, King Aeetes, ruled with iron masked in gold, and her brother Apsyrtus stood as both shield and chain. But Medea's true loyalty was never to throne or kin. It was to knowledge, to will, and later, disastrously, to love. When Jason arrived, handsome and ambitious, bearing a hero's name and a liar's smile, Medea saw something rare, a man who needed her, not just for beauty, but for what she knew. And for reasons only Aphrodite could explain, she gave him everything. With her spells, Jason survived the impossible. With her betrayal, he stole the Golden Fleece. With her hands, she scattered the limbs of her own brother into the sea. These were not acts of passion, but of purpose, each choice rooted in something deeper than desire. Medea did not weep when she fled Colchis. She did not plead when the gods turned their faces. She sailed westward, her name already growing darker behind her. In Iolcus, she murdered with elegance, tricking the daughters of Peleus into filicide through ritual, a lesson masked as magic. And when she and Jason were driven out and took refuge in Corinth, Medea did not beg for peace. She adapted. She endured. She bore Jason children. She stitched a life from what was left of her exile. But men are not gods, and Jason's loyalty had an expiration. He grew bored with the woman who had saved him. He wished for a queen's daughter, a throne more secure, a reputation untarnished by foreign sorcery. So he arranged to marry Glaus, daughter of Creon, king of Corinth. Medea, cast aside, was offered gold and exile, as if her sacrifice could be swept beneath courtly rugs. But Medea was not a Greek wife. She was not a name to be forgotten. She was a force sculpted by betrayal, sharpened by abandonment, and what Jason did not understand or refuse to remember was that a sorceress wounded is more dangerous than any soldier armed. First, she sent Glaus a wedding dress laced with unseen fire. The fabric clung to her skin, and the flames devoured her body before anyone could understand the spell. Creon, rushing to save his daughter, caught the blaze himself, and both perished in a pyre not built by logs, but by vengeance. Then Medea turned inward. She took the unthinkable step, one only the Furies might understand. She killed her own children, not for pleasure, not even for revenge, but because she knew it was the only wound Jason could never heal. If he would take her future, she would erase his. If he would break her heart, she would silence his lineage. And then she fled, Carried away by a chariot drawn by dragons, a gift from her grandfather Helios, she vanished from Corinth, leaving screams behind. The gods did not stop her. No mortal hand reached her. Medea was not judged, only feared. In Athens, she found temporary haven. King Aegeus offered her marriage and safety, but her past, like a shadow at dusk, followed close. When Theseus returned and her plots were uncovered, she vanished once again, slipping into the fog of myth where witches live and legends fester. But Medea's story did not end in death, because the Greeks never fully killed her. She was too powerful, too complex. Some said she lived among the spirits of Hecate, priestess of the underworld. Others claimed she wandered east, founding kingdoms, whispering to stars. What remained undeniable was her legacy. She was not a victim, nor a heroine. She was something older than both, a woman who knew what gods knew, that love is rarely pure, and power never comes without cost. To the Greeks, Medea was a warning wrapped in enchantment. To women, perhaps a mirror reflecting pain society refused to name. And to the gods, maybe, just maybe, a reminder that mortals too can wield divine fury, not with thunder, but with silence, fire, and the choice to walk away from everything and everyone without looking back. Before Athens had its philosophers and orators, it had Theseus, a man woven from the same thread as myths and marble. He was born of two fathers, or so the stories go. His mother, Aethra, lay with Aegeus, king of Athens, and on that same night with Poseidon, god of the sea. Whether divine or mortal, his blood carried something sharp and restless. He grew up in Trojan, far from the politics of his future, until he came of age and was told of his destiny. Beneath a heavy boulder, his father had left a sword and sandals. Only when he could lift the stone would he be ready to claim his birthright. Theseus, still young, heaved the weight aside and took up the blade. Not just a weapon, but a sign that the journey had begun. But rather than sail the safe road to Athens, he chose the perilous land route, where monsters waited in shadows, as if daring fate to test him. Each step along the way became a chapter in legend. He defeated Periphetes, the club-wielding giant. He outwitted Sinis, the pine-bender, who tied victims to trees and tore them apart. He punished Siren, who kicked travelers into the sea to be devoured by a monstrous turtle. Theseus turned each cruelty back upon its master, not with pity, but with precision. He was not just strong, he was clever, and that cunning carried him farther than mere muscle ever could. By the time he reached Athens, stories of his deeds had already arrived ahead of him. But the palace was not waiting with open arms. Medea, now wife to King Aegeus, feared this young man who threatened her place. She plotted to poison him, but at the last moment Aegeus recognized the sword, the same one he had left under the stone. He dashed the poison aside and embraced Theseus as his son. Yet peace in Athens was fragile. The city, long under pressure from Crete, was forced to send tribute every 9 years, 7 young men and 7 young women, to be devoured by the Minotaur, a creature half man, half bull, hidden deep within the labyrinth of King Minos. Theseus, disgusted by the arrangement, volunteered to be among the chosen, not as a sacrifice but as a reckoning. He sailed to Crete with the others, hiding purpose beneath obedience. When they arrived, the gods intervened. Ariadne, daughter of Minos, saw him and fell in love. She gave him 2 things, a sword to kill the beast and a spool of thread to find his way back through the labyrinth. And so, Theseus descended into the dark, not just into stone walls, but into legend. The Minotaur waited in the heart of the maze, snarling hunger and exile. Born of a curse, it was a symbol of shame and secrecy. Theseus fought without hesitation. With a sword in hand, he struck the creature down, and using the thread, emerged from the coils of shadow back into the light. With Ariadne, he fled Crete, carrying triumph in one hand and love in the other. But as with many Greek tales, joy was fleeting. On the island of Naxos, Theseus abandoned Ariadne. Some say it was the god's will that Dionysus claimed her. Others say Theseus, ever calculating, left her behind for reasons buried too deep for poetry. Regardless, he sailed on, but in forgetting to change his sails from black to white, he delivered heartbreak to Athens. His father, watching the horizon, saw black sails and believed his son dead. In despair, Aegeus threw himself into the sea that would bear his name, and Theseus returned not as a son, but as a king. His reign brought unity to the scattered lands of Attica. He reformed laws, centralized worship, and laid the foundation of what would become classical Athens. Yet the hero's path darkened with time. He took part in the abduction of Helen when she was still a child, planning to wed her when she came of age. He journeyed with Pirithous into the underworld to steal Persephone, a mission so foolish that even Hades found it laughable. Trapped by the very throne of the dead, Theseus remained bound in Tartarus until Heracles pulled him free. But not all stains could be washed away. His wife Phaedra, consumed by forbidden desire for his son Hippolytus, accused the boy of assault after he rejected her. Theseus, blind in anger, cursed his own son, who died shortly after. When the truth surfaced, it was too late. The house had already crumbled. Theseus's end was not marked by war or glory. He was driven into exile by political unrest. In Scyros, he was betrayed by a king who feared him, pushed from a cliff into the sea. There were no songs for his funeral, only silence and a kingdom that had moved on. Yet his legacy lived in stones and scrolls. Temples were built in his honor. His name became synonymous with courage and law. But beneath the marble, there was a man who had walked willingly into darkness again and again until he became part of it. Theseus was a hero, but not without blemish. He rose high, fell far, and left behind a trail of choices that would echo through generations. He was not Achilles, who burned brightly and fast, nor Odysseus, who endured with wit. He was something else, a builder of cities, a breaker of hearts, a wanderer in both justice and folly. In his footsteps, Athens found its shape. In his failures, Greece found its caution. Among all the bloodlines that populate Greek mythology, none are as relentlessly tragic as the House of Atreus. It was not simply a tale of misfortune, but of a curse so deep that it soaked into every generation, passed like a silent poison through time. The origin of their doom lay not with Atreus himself, but with his ancestor Tantalus, a king favored by the gods, who dined at their table on Olympus until his pride transformed into horror. In a moment of grotesque arrogance, Tantalus slaughtered his own son, Pelops, and served him to the gods to test their wisdom. All recoiled in revulsion except Demeter, distracted by the loss of Persephone, who took a bite of the shoulder. As punishment, Tantalus was cast into Tartarus, eternally tormented with water he could not drink and fruit he could not reach. The gods restored Pelops to life, crafting a shoulder of ivory to replace what had been eaten. Yet the curse had been born, and though Pelops lived, its shadow followed him. Pelops grew to be a powerful man and married Hippodamia, daughter of King Oenomaus. To win her hand, he had to defeat her father in a chariot race, a contest that had claimed the lives of many suitors. Pelops, unwilling to rely solely on skill, convinced the king's charioteer, Myrtilus, to sabotage the chariot. Myrtilus agreed, but when he demanded his reward, a night with Hippodamia, Pelops killed him and threw him into the sea. As Myrtilus fell, he cursed Pelops and his line. That curse rooted itself like a seed, and from it bloomed generations of betrayal, murder, and vengeance. Pelops and Hippodamia had many children, but the two most infamous were Atreus and Thyestes, brothers who would make the gods weep. The struggle between Atreus and Thyestes was born from ambition and fed by treachery. When the throne of Mycenae was at stake, the two brothers sought power through deception. Atreus vowed to sacrifice his most prized lamb to Artemis, but when a golden ram appeared, he hid it away instead. His wife Erope betrayed him by giving the ram to Thyestes, who used it to claim the throne. Yet the gods sided with Atreus, and when his kingship was restored, he invited Thyestes to a feast under the guise of reconciliation. But Atreus had slaughtered Thyestes' sons and served them as the main course. Thyestes ate, unaware, until Atreus revealed the truth. Horrified, he fled into exile, cursing his brother with a vengeance only the gods could fathom. But the curse was not finished. In exile, Thyestes sought guidance from an oracle, and was told that the only way to destroy Atreus was to father a child with his own daughter, Penelope. The child born of this union was Aegisthus, a boy conceived through deception and destined for blood. Atreus, unaware of the child's origin, raised him in his court until Aegisthus one day learned the truth and murdered Atreus, fulfilling the bitter cycle. Power passed again through treachery, and from this tangled legacy rose Agamemnon and Menelaus, sons of Atreus, who inherited not just the throne of Mycenae and Sparta, but also the weight of their family's sins. The curse of the house of Atreus did not rest. It clung to every generation like a fog, staining every crown, every decision. It whispered in palace halls, stirred during sacrificial rites, and hardened hearts against mercy. In the story of this house, the gods did not intervene to protect or punish. They watched, perhaps in pity, perhaps in curiosity, as mortals turned on each other with precision and wrath. The sins of fathers became the burdens of sons. The line of Atreus was not simply tragic. It was emblematic of a truth the Greeks understood well, that fate, once disturbed, does not forget, and blood spilled unjustly can echo through centuries. The Greeks recounted the tale of this house not only as a warning, but as a mirror. In its darkest corners, they saw reflections of their own ambitions, betrayals, and longing for redemption. The house of Atreus stood not just as a legend, but as a lesson carved into time, that curses are not always cast by gods, but often born from the choices mortals make when they believe they are untouchable. And as with all ancient stories, the end was never truly the end, only the start of another chapter in a legacy that would continue with Agamemnon, Clytemnestra, Orestes, and Electra. Agamemnon was born into a legacy soaked in blood and betrayal. As the son of Atreus, his throne in Mycenae was not built upon peace, but forged in the fire of vengeance. He was shaped not by gentle rule, but by the echo of curses stretching back to Tantalus. From the moment he took the scepter, Agamemnon carried more than a crown. He carried the weight of a family that had fed sons to fathers and spilled innocence for power. His wife Clytemnestra was no stranger to bloodlines either. She was the sister of Helen of Troy, Queen of Sparta, and the two families were intertwined in duty, ambition, and tragedy. Agamemnon married not just a woman, but a kingdom. And when Helen was taken by Paris to Troy, his obligation extended beyond personal insult. He became commander of all Greek forces, leading 1,000 ships to war, not just for honor, but for legacy. But the gods do not grant smooth passage to those cursed, and the winds refuse to rise. Trapped in Aulis, with soldiers growing restless and supplies dwindling, the seers told him the price: his daughter Iphigenia. Artemis had been offended. Whether by Agamemnon's pride or a past slight, none could say, and only blood could balance the scales. And so Agamemnon summoned his wife and daughter under the lie of marriage, claiming Achilles awaited a bride. When Iphigenia arrived, the altar waited too. Some say Artemis, in pity or irony, replaced the girl with a deer at the last moment. Others say the blade did fall, but whether the blood was spilled or merely promised, the damage was done. Clytemnestra returned to Mycenae with a silent scream inside her, and Agamemnon sailed toward Troy with ghosts already in his shadow. At Troy, he became a commander feared more than loved. His pride matched his power, and he clashed with Achilles, the greatest warrior among them. When Agamemnon seized Briseis, Achilles' war prize, he insulted not just a man, but a legend. Achilles withdrew, and the Greeks suffered. Only with the death of Patroclus did Achilles return, and Agamemnon's leadership survived not through brilliance, but through momentum. The city burned, but the cost was steep. 10 years passed, and Agamemnon became less a king and more a relic of a war that had demanded everything. When Troy finally fell, he claimed Cassandra, daughter of Priam, as his prize. A prophetess cursed never to be believed, her eyes filled with truths no one wished to hear. His return to Mycenae should have been triumphant, but fate does not forget. Clytemnestra, still seething over Iphigenia's death, had taken Aegisthus, Agamemnon's cousin and rival, as lover and ally. Together they plotted not just revenge, but retribution in the name of every woman silenced, every child sacrificed. When Agamemnon arrived, Cassandra saw it clearly. She warned him of the danger, spoke of blood in the halls, of betrayal lying in wait. But as always, no one listened to Cassandra. Agamemnon walked into his palace, into the trap. In some versions, Clytemnestra killed him in the bath, striking 3 times, once for each daughter stolen from her. In others, Aegisthus held the blade. But all stories agree. The king returned not to applause, but to the blade. Cassandra too was slain, her warning silenced at last. And Clytemnestra stood not as a mad woman, but as an avenger. She claimed justice where justice had long been denied. Yet the curse was not lifted, only extended. For in killing Agamemnon, she invited the wrath of their son, Orestes, who would return in time to continue the cycle. The house of Atreus devoured its own endlessly, and Agamemnon's death was just one link in the chain. He had led the greatest army Greece had known, but could not escape the shadows at home. In the end, he was not felled by Trojan spears or divine wrath, but by a woman who had once loved him in a prophecy he never heeded. Agamemnon's legacy lived on in ruins, in the stones of Troy, in the whispers of Mycenae, and in the hearts of those who saw that power without wisdom leads not to glory, but to downfall. His name became a lesson, his story a warning, that greatness achieved on foreign soil can be unraveled in the quiet rooms of one's own home, and that sometimes the wounds we leave behind return not with swords, but with silence and memory sharpened into revenge. The story of Orestes did not begin with choice, but with legacy, a legacy written in the blood of kings and the silence of halls once filled with laughter. He was the son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, born not to peace, but to the aftermath of old sins, raised in a palace haunted by secrets and shadows. As a boy, he may not have understood the weight placed upon him, but he could not escape it. His father, having led the Greek armies to victory at Troy, returned home only to be murdered by the very hands that once embraced him. His mother, once a queen, had become an executioner, and her lover Aegisthus sat smug upon the throne, meant for Agamemnon's heir. Orestes, too young to act, was smuggled away into exile, saved not by warriors, but by the quiet determination of loyal servants, and the unspoken hope that one day the child would return to restore balance. He was raised in Phocis under the care of King Strophius, and alongside his cousin Pylades, a boy who would become more than family, a brother not of blood but of choice. Orestes learned not just how to wield a sword, but how to navigate the weight of fate and the cold necessity of revenge. As he grew older, the whispers of Mycenae reached his ears. He learned of his mother's crime, of the blood spilled in the name of justice, and of his father's grave sitting unwept by its rightful son. But the gods, as ever, were not idle observers. Apollo spoke to Orestes through the oracle at Delphi, commanding him to return, to avenge his father, and to cleanse the curse that had stained his lineage for generations. The task was clear, but the burden was unbearable. To kill a mother, to spill blood that birthed him, and to do so not with rage but with duty. When Orestes returned to Mycenae, it was not in armor or with an army. He came quietly, disguised as a traveler, bearing false news of his own death. This ruse brought him into the palace, into the heart of the very place where his father had been betrayed. Clytemnestra, believing the lie, let down her guard, and Aegisthus too welcomed what he thought was closure. But when Orestes revealed himself, the truth struck faster than any blade. He killed Aegisthus first, swiftly, a clean strike for a man who had stolen more than a crown. But when he turned to his mother, the sword grew heavier in his hand. Clytemnestra did not beg. She reminded him that she had given him life, that she had nursed him, that the breast he now threatened had once fed him in love. Yet Orestes remembered his father, his duty, and the voice of Apollo, and so trembling, he struck. But vengeance does not clean wounds. It often deepens them. As the blood cooled, the Furies awoke. Ancient goddesses older than Olympus itself, they rose from the underworld to punish the crime of matricide. Though Apollo had commanded it, they cared not for divine politics. Orestes had spilled sacred blood, and so they pursued him with eyes that never closed and claws that never tired. Madness overtook him. He wandered across Greece, tormented by visions, by screams only he could hear, by the eternal whisper of guilt that no prayer could silence. It was not justice that haunted him. It was judgment unending, the kind that lives in the corners of the soul. Eventually, Orestes found refuge in Athens, where he threw himself at the mercy of the goddess Athena. She, wise and impartial, did not dismiss his crime, but offered a trial, the first of its kind, a court of justice to weigh guilt not with vengeance, but with reason. The Furies argued for punishment, their voices filled with the weight of ancient law. Apollo defended his servant, declaring that justice demanded balance. The jury of Athenians split their vote, unable to agree. And Athena, casting the deciding ballot, chose mercy. Orestes was absolved, not because he was innocent, but because the world could no longer survive on revenge alone. The Furies, at first enraged, were offered a place in Athens as protectors of justice, transformed from agents of wrath to guardians of law. Orestes, freed from his torment, returned to Mycenae not just as a son, but as a man who had walked through madness and emerged changed. He would rule, marry, and eventually find peace, a peace that had eluded his father, his mother, and every ancestor before him. Yet the story of Orestes was more than a tale of revenge. It was the moment when Greek mythology turned its gaze inward and asked what justice truly meant. Was it the repetition of blood for blood, or the courage to end the cycle? To the Greeks, Orestes represented a turning point, a hero not defined by brute strength or divine favor, but by endurance, by the struggle between duty and conscience. He did what no other in his house had done. He survived the curse not by fleeing it, but by facing it fully, letting it consume him, and then stepping out of its ashes. In his story, they saw a reflection of their own shifting world, one where law began to challenge vengeance, and where mercy, fragile and uncertain, found a voice among the echoes of the past. In the ruins of Mycenae's once proud palace, where blood had stained the stone and whispers replaced music, Electra endured. She was the daughter of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, born into royalty but raised in ruin, her life unfolding not with celebration, but with grief. When her father returned from Troy, she saw him walk into his own death, lured by warm baths and cold betrayal. She saw her mother's new lover, Aegisthus, take the throne, not with valor, but with calculated cruelty. And while her brother Orestes was sent into exile to preserve his life, Electra remained. She lived under the same roof as her father's murderer, her mother, forced into silence, forced to serve a house that had devoured its king. But she did not forget. She did not forgive. In the quiet corners of the palace, She carried the memory of Agamemnon like a flame cupped in shaking hands. Years passed, but Electra never let the fire go out. She became a ghost in her own home, watching, remembering, and waiting. Clytemnestra did not treat her like a daughter, but like a relic of a mistake. Aegisthus saw her as a threat too small to kill, but too dangerous to ignore. They arranged her marriage not to a nobleman, but to a common farmer, a strategy meant to bury her lineage in obscurity. Yet even in that life, Electra refused to surrender her grief. Her husband, humble and kind, respected her vow to remain unbroken. She kept her mourning clothes, her anger, and her prayers to the gods who had remained silent for so long. She spoke to Orestes in her dreams, imagining the day he would return. And though no word reached her, she believed. For Electra, faith was not a comfort. It was the only weapon she had. When Orestes did finally return, disguised and cautious, it was Electra who saw through the mask. Her heart recognized what her eyes could not confirm. Their reunion was not loud or tearful, but steady, like the meeting of two rivers long separated by stone. They shared stories, pain, and a plan. For revenge was no longer an impulse. It was the only justice they knew. With the help of Pylades, Orestes' loyal friend, they carried out their mission. Aegisthus was slain without ceremony. But when they turned to Clytemnestra, the blade trembled. She had not simply been a queen or a traitor. She had been their mother. Her voice, once soft with lullabies, now pleaded for mercy. Yet the weight of her crime and the years Electra had suffered under her shadow left no room for mercy. The sword fell, and the silence afterward was heavier than any cry. But the gods do not let blood flow without consequence. The Furies came, ancient and relentless, to punish the shedding of kin. They chased Orestes into madness, but for Electra there was no madness, only emptiness. Her role had been fulfilled, but her purpose, once so sharp, now dulled into memory. She returned to a palace quiet with ghosts. Her brother fled to find absolution, but she remained not a hero, not a villain, but a woman who had waited too long to be anything else. The people of Mycenae saw her as a symbol of loyalty, a daughter who refused to forget. But loyalty, like grief, carves deep lines, and Electra's face, once young with hope, became a mask shaped by sorrow. Her name endured not through victory, but through constancy. In tragedies written by men who had never felt her loss, she was both praised and pitied. She became a figure of mourning, a sister frozen in the moment between promise and fulfillment. Yet Electra was more than a mourner. She was a reminder that vengeance is never clean, that justice demands a price even from the innocent. She was a thread in the greater tapestry of Greek myth, quiet but unbreakable, stretching from palace halls to dusty roads, from sacrifice to silence. And when the stories ended, when the last chorus sang and the torches dimmed, Electra remained, not in triumph, not in peace, but in truth. Her life was not a tale of love or conquest, but of memory. And memory, when it refuses to fade, becomes its own kind of power. The gods may forget and kings may fall, but the eyes of a sister who waited through darkness see farther than any oracle. Before the gods of Olympus ruled the heavens with golden thrones and polished words, there were older forces in the world, ancient, dark, and unflinching. Among them were the Furies, known to the Greeks as the Erinyes, daughters of primordial night and the very essence of vengeance itself. They did not live on mountaintops or bask in ambrosia. They dwelled in the shadowed cracks of the earth, in the stillness after blood was spilled, in the silence that follows a scream. They were not born to punish the wicked in general, but to chase down those who broke the sacred bonds of family. Sons who killed mothers, brothers who betrayed brothers, and kin who lifted blades against their own blood. In their eyes, murder was not merely a crime, it was a disruption of nature's oldest balance, a tear in the fabric of ancestral order. And for that, there was no forgiveness. The Furies were not beautiful, nor did they try to be. They were winged, snake-haired, and cloaked in robes that seemed woven from funeral smoke. Their eyes burned, not with fire, but with relentless memory. They could not be bribed or deceived. No temple was built to worship them, only shrines to appease them, to beg them to look elsewhere, to let guilt lie unawakened. When Orestes killed Clytemnestra, fulfilling Apollo's command and avenging his father, it was not the gods of Olympus who stirred, it was the Furies who rose, howling not out of anger, but out of duty. They chased him not because they hated him, but because they had always existed to do so. His crime, however justified in mortal eyes, had echoed in their realm like thunder, and once they heard it, they could not rest. Orestes fled from city to city, but they followed, never speaking, only wailing. They did not need to touch him to cause pain. Their very presence frayed the mind, unraveling thought and sleep. He saw them in the corners of his vision, heard them in the moments between heartbeats, felt them in the weight of every breath. Madness crept into his bones like frost, and still the Furies came. No priest could banish them, no offering could satisfy them. Only when he reached Athens did hope flicker, for there Athena had founded a new way, a trial, a weighing of law over tradition, of fairness over fury. Yet when the trial began, the Furies did not simply grow silent. They stood and spoke, ancient voices shaking even the marble pillars of the court. They argued not as monsters, but as keepers of balance. They reminded the judges that blood cannot be washed away with speeches, that family ties are not threads to be cut without consequence. To them, Orestes had not acted with courage, but with hubris. Apollo defended his servant, citing divine command and justice for Agamemnon's murder. The court of Athenians listened, torn between old duty and new ideals. The vote was split, and then Athena, goddess of wisdom and cities, cast her deciding vote, not for punishment, but for mercy. Orestes was freed. The curse in that moment was broken, but the Furies did not vanish. Their howls did not become silence. Instead, Athena did something no god had done before. She offered them purpose. She renamed them the Eumenides, the kindly ones. She gave them a new role in the heart of Athens, as protectors of justice, as guardians of the law, not through vengeance, but through order. And remarkably, the Furies accepted. They were not defeated, they were transformed. Their essence remained, but their method changed. No longer would they chase the guilty until madness consumed them. Instead, they would dwell in the courtrooms, in the judgments, in the quiet dignity of law. For even the oldest powers, it seemed, could find a new place in a changing world. Not all myths end with fire or thunder. Some end with compromise, with understanding, with the weight of tradition bending ever so slightly towards something gentler. To the Greeks, the Furies remained a presence not to be dismissed. They were invoked in oaths, feared in whispers, and remembered in moments when the line between justice and revenge blurred. They were the bridge between the old world and the new, a reminder that even in civilization's glow, the shadows do not disappear, they evolve. In their story, we see the pain of justice, the necessity of mercy, and the power of transformation. For even fury, when tempered by wisdom, can become something enduring, something necessary, something sacred. Before spears clashed on the plains of Troy, and 1,000 ships sailed under stormy skies, before Achilles fell and Hector's body was dragged behind a chariot, there was an apple, simple, golden, and inscribed with words that no god could ignore. To the fairest, it read, and with that, Eris, the goddess of discord, flung it into a wedding she had not been invited to. It was the union of Peleus and Thetis, a rare moment when gods and mortals feasted together, a celebration meant to bind the sea to the land in harmony. But harmony does not interest Eris. She thrives where envy lives, where comparison begins. Her apple was not a gift, but a spark. Hera, queen of the gods, Athena, goddess of wisdom, and Aphrodite, goddess of love, all three laid claim to it. Each saw in those two words a mirror, and each believed the reflection belonged to her alone. Zeus, unwilling to choose between his wife, his daughter, and the goddess who governed desire, deflected the burden to a mortal. That mortal was Paris, a prince of Troy, raised in obscurity by shepherds after a prophecy had warned his father, King Priam, that his birth would lead to the city's destruction. Handsome, young, and unaware of the fate resting on his shoulders, Paris lived a life of quiet charm until the gods brought him to a glade on Mount Ida and placed eternity in his hands. One by one, the goddesses approached him, not with honesty, but with offers. Hera promised power, the rule of all Asia, a kingdom that would stretch beyond what the eye could see. Athena promised wisdom and victory, triumph in war, brilliance in counsel, the kind of glory sung for generations. And Aphrodite, with a smile older than time, promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris did not ponder long. He gave the apple to Aphrodite, and with that simple gesture, the seeds of the Trojan War were planted. For the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, queen of Sparta, already wed to King Menelaus. Paris, aided by Aphrodite's magic, or perhaps his own charm, journeyed to Sparta and either seduced or stole Helen away. Stories vary. Some say she went willingly, drawn by love or longing. Others claim she was taken, another pawn in a divine game. Regardless, when she left with Paris and crossed the sea to Troy, the Greeks stirred. Honor had been insulted, bonds broken. Menelaus called upon the oath sworn by all of Helen's former suitors to defend her marriage, to punish any who would take her. And so kings and warriors from every corner of Greece gathered, not for Helen perhaps, but for pride, for spoils, for the glory that only war could offer. But none of them would have lifted a sword had Paris not made a choice in a quiet glade. None of them would have burned Troy if Eris had stayed away. The judgment of Paris was more than a myth. It was a moment where vanity met destiny, where the gods in their eternal rivalry used mortals as pieces on a board carved from ambition. Paris, for all his innocence, became a symbol of impulse. He chose beauty over wisdom, desire over sovereignty. Some saw him as foolish, others as honest. For who among mortals could resist love, especially when offered by the goddess of it? But love, as the Greeks knew, rarely walks alone. She brings jealousy, war, betrayal. The apple had done its work. Hera and Athena did not forget. Their wrath, unlike Aphrodite's favor, lasted years. They sided with the Greeks, fueling storms, guiding arrows, ensuring that Troy, city of walls said to be built by gods, would fall. Paris, meanwhile, lived in the eye of the storm he had created. He fought, yes, but never with the ferocity of Hector. He loved, yes, but never with the depth that could soothe a nation's grief. In the end, he died as he had lived, tangled in a love larger than himself, remembered not for deeds but for decisions. The Greeks told this story not to scorn him, but to reflect on the weight of choice. A single moment, a single judgment can bend the path of history. In that golden apple, the Greeks saw themselves, their hunger for beauty, their pride, their curses. It was not the sword that doomed Troy, but the need to be named the fairest, the desire to be chosen. The gods, for all their power, mirrored mortals in their vanity. And mortals in turn paid the price for divine games. The war that followed would span 10 years, take countless lives, and reshape the stories of heroes and kings. But before all that, there was just a boy, a prince, a shepherd, holding an apple and deciding who deserved to be loved most. Helen of Troy was not born a villain, nor a heroine, but a question. She was the daughter of Leda, and according to the myths, of Zeus, who came to her mother in the form of a swan. From her earliest days, she was known for a beauty that unsettled the world, a beauty so striking that poets stumbled and kings paused. She grew not just into a woman, but into a symbol of desire, of conflict, of everything men both longed for and feared. As a child, she was stolen once by Theseus, hidden away until her brothers retrieved her. As a maiden, she became the prize of suitors from every corner of Greece, each more powerful than the last. And to prevent bloodshed, her father chose one, Menelaus, king of Sparta, not the boldest perhaps, but strong and steady. The others swore an oath to defend that marriage, to protect it as if it were their own. It was an oath that would one day ignite the greatest war Greece had ever known. Helen lived as Queen of Sparta, bearing a daughter, Hermione, and keeping the peace of a quiet life. But peace does not hold long in myth. Paris came, young, golden, and promised her love by Aphrodite herself. Whether Helen fell willingly into his arms or was taken against her will has been debated for centuries. Some stories tell of her eyes lighting up when she saw him, of a longing that swept her away like wind across the sea. Others speak of hesitation, of spells, of gods bending her will for their own designs. But what followed was not romance, it was exile. She left Sparta, left her child, and sailed to Troy. And as the sails filled behind her, the oath her former suitors had sworn years ago hardened into action. 1,000 ships launched to retrieve her. Heroes like Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, and Agamemnon marched toward Troy not just for honor, but for the prize of reclaiming what was lost. Helen stood behind Troy's high walls, watching a war born of her face, her choice, or perhaps her curse. Inside the city, she was a queen, yet not welcomed. Many saw her as the cause of their suffering, their sons buried in Greek swords and Trojan dust. Even Priam, Troy's king, treated her with distance, courteous but cold. And Helen, trapped between loyalty and regret, bore the weight of every death. She was not armed, she did not fight, yet every name carved into marble seemed to echo her own. Paris, once golden, grew weary. His love, once whispered, was now weighed against the cost. And Helen, once desired, became a question none could answer. When Troy fell, as it always would, Helen's fate hung in the balance. Menelaus, her husband, stormed the palace. He raised his sword, ready to cut her down, but dropped it when he saw her face, unchanged by time, untouched by ruin. Some say it was love, others say it was pity, or perhaps magic still lingered on her skin. Regardless, he brought her home. Sparta received her not with songs, but with silence, and Helen lived out her days as queen once more, surrounded by whispers. Some said she never aged. Others believed she was never mortal at all, a daughter of gods cursed to live among men. Her story became a mirror, reflecting beauty, blame, and the myths men build to explain the choices they do not understand. The poets could never decide if Helen was guilty or innocent, selfish or sacred. To Homer, she was regretful. To Euripides, she was a phantom, replaced by a cloud while the real Helen waited in Egypt. To later generations, she became the question at the heart of war. Was it ever about her at all, or about the pride of men who used her name as cause? In truth, Helen was not the cause of the war, but the excuse. She was the ember the gods used to burn a world too full of vanity and vengeance. She was remembered not for what she did, but for what others did because of her. Her beauty was a story told so often, it stopped being about her and became about everything she could never control. Helen of Troy did not choose to become a myth. She lived, perhaps loved, perhaps mourned, but the world would not let her be a woman. It needed her to be more. So she became the face that launched 1,000 ships, the muse of endless verses, the still figure at the center of storm and song. And when she died, or vanished or ascended, No one truly knew what became of her, but her story remained, whispered in the sea's breath, painted in the red of war, lingering in the quiet sigh before a battle cry. Achilles was not born to live a quiet life. From the moment Thetis, his sea nymph mother, dipped him in the river Styx to make him invulnerable, save for the heel she held, his path was marked not by peace but by promise. He was the son of a mortal king, Peleus, and a divine mother who foresaw his fate and tried in vain to shield him from it. She knew he would either die young with eternal glory or live long in obscurity. And so she dressed him as a girl, hid him among the daughters of Skyros, and hoped fate would look elsewhere. But destiny, like a hound, does not lose a scent. Odysseus found him, lured him into revealing his warrior nature, and thus Achilles, barely more than a boy, was drawn into a war that would define him and be defined by him in return. At Troy, Achilles was more than a soldier. He was a storm wrapped in bronze, swift-footed, golden-haired, and unstoppable. He led the Myrmidons, warriors as fierce as their master, and from the first clash on the beaches to the 10th year of siege, his name was both shield and sword. No warrior could stand against him. He killed for honor, for pride, for Greece. But beneath the helmet and the ash, there lived a man shaped by wrath and wounded by pride. When Agamemnon, the Greek high king, claimed Briseis, a woman Achilles had taken as a prize of war but come to care for, the hero did not simply protest. He withdrew. He refused to fight. And with that single decision, the tide of war shifted. For without Achilles, even the might of Greece could not hold the line. His absence was not silence. It was thunder held at bay, a tension that gripped the battlefield. The Trojans, emboldened, pressed forward. Hector, Prince of Troy, led the charge, pushing the Greeks back to their ships. Men died, not because Achilles killed them, but because he chose not to. In his tent, he brooded, not because he lacked courage, but because he had been dishonored. And in that rage, there was something deeply human, not godlike detachment, but the sting of being wronged by those who should have stood beside him. But rage, like all fires, consumes what's nearest first. When Patroclus, his dearest companion, begged to borrow his armor and lead the Myrmidons in his place, Achilles agreed. Not out of strategy, but out of affection. He believed Patroclus could hold the line, remind the Trojans that the shadow of Achilles still loomed. But Patroclus did more than hold the line. He pushed forward too far. Wearing Achilles' armor, he became a symbol of hope and dread. The Trojans believed the great warrior had returned, and they faltered. But Hector, noble and brave, met him in combat and struck him down. The death of Patroclus was not just a loss, it was the unsealing of fury. When Achilles learned of it, the ground seemed to shake beneath his grief. He did not weep like a boy, he howled like something ancient. He swore vengeance not only against Hector, but against fate itself. He returned to the battlefield clad in new armor forged by Hephaestus, blazing like dawn. And as he cut through Trojan ranks, it was not a battle, it was devastation. He found Hector before the gates of Troy. The two faced each other, not as enemies born of hatred, but as men who understood each other in ways their nations never would. They circled, they fought. And when Achilles killed Hector, he did not stop at death. He tied the body to his chariot and dragged it through the dust, not once but again and again, until even the gods turned their eyes away. And still he was not satisfied. Only when Priam, Hector's aged father, came in the night, not with sword but with tears, begging for his son's body, did Achilles pause. He looked at the man who had once feared him and saw instead the shape of his own father. In that quiet, something shifted. Achilles wept. Not for the war, not even for Patroclus, but for the sorrow that all men must carry when rage begins to fade. Achilles knew he would die. It had been foretold. And still, he stayed. For glory, for grief, for the threads of fate he could no longer untangle. He killed many more, including Memnon, son of the dawn, and the Amazon queen Penthesilea, whose beauty stunned him even as her blood stained his blade. But destiny waits with patience. It came not in the form of a warrior, but of an arrow guided by Paris and the god Apollo, striking the one place left unguarded, his heel. Achilles fell, not with the noise of thunder, but like a great tower slowly giving into time. His body was burned, his ashes mixed with those of Patroclus, a final union in death, if not in life. And though the war continued, and other names rose and fell, it was Achilles whom the poets sang of, whose rage lit the Iliad, whose sorrow made gods cry. To the Greeks, Achilles was not a hero because he was flawless. He was a hero because he felt deeply, fought fiercely, and bore the consequences of both. He was wrath and grief and loyalty and doom, all in one. And long after Troy's towers crumbled and the names of kings faded, it was Achilles who remained, not in marble but in memory. In the heart of Troy, beyond its high walls and marble columns, lived a man who bore the weight of a city, not through ambition, but through duty. Hector, eldest son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba, was not crafted in the mold of capricious gods or tempestuous heroes. He was not gifted with immortal armor or divine rage. His greatness lay in something far rarer, a quiet, unwavering devotion to his people, to his family, and to a future he knew might never come. From the first beat of war to the final clang of bronze, Hector stood not as a symbol of conquest, but as a shield. His sword did not seek glory. It sought to hold back the tide for just one more day, to protect the lives that looked to him not as a warrior, but as a father, a brother, a son. Though the war had begun over Helen, Hector knew that names were only banners under which older forces marched. He did not believe Paris had chosen wisely, nor did he revel in the destruction that followed. Yet he fought, not out of pride, but because his city had no one else who could bear the burden. Each day he led the Trojans into battle, not with arrogance, but with resolve. He faced Greek champions, outmatched in fame, but rarely in courage. He rallied men who had lost brothers, consoled mothers who had lost sons, and carried the hopes of Troy in every measured step. And when night fell, he returned not to feast, but to his wife Andromache and their infant son, Astyanax. In the quiet of their chambers, he was not a general. He was a man who feared he would never see his child grow, a husband who wished the gods could be kinder. Andromache begged him to stay behind the walls, to choose life over legend. But Hector, with sorrow in his voice, told her that shame before the city would be worse than death. He knew that one day Troy might fall, that his name might be carved among the fallen, but until that day he would stand. For Hector, courage was not the absence of fear. It was the act of stepping forward despite it. He did not burn with the wrath of Achilles, nor shine with the cunning of Odysseus. He burned with love, for his family, for his people, for a home he could not abandon. And that love made him stronger than any prophecy, even if it could not save him in the end. When Achilles returned to the battlefield, drawn by the death of Patroclus, Hector did not flinch. He knew what was coming. The Myrmidons cut through the Trojan lines like wind through dry grass. Hector stood before the gates, knowing he would not return. Priam begged him to come inside. His mother tore at her breast and hair, pleading for her son to live. But Hector waited. He had taken Patroclus's life, and now fate had come to claim its balance. As Achilles approached, Hector's courage did not falter, though his feet briefly did. He ran, not from cowardice, but from the terrible weight of all that was ending. 3 times around the city they circled, until finally Athena tricked Hector, appearing as his brother, giving him false confidence. They fought beneath the watch of gods and men, but the outcome was already written. Achilles struck him down, his spear finding the place where armor could not reach. And as Hector fell, he asked for his body to be returned to his family, to be honored, not defiled. But Achilles, blinded by grief, refused. He tied Hector's body to his chariot and dragged it before the walls of Troy. Yet even in death, Hector did not become a figure of pity. He became a symbol. A father's tears would retrieve his body. A nation's mourning would crown his memory, and his name would stand long after his city crumbled. To the Greeks, Hector was an enemy, but to Homer, he was the soul of the Iliad. His death marked not triumph, but tragedy. He was the man who fought for peace in a war that knew none. He was the warrior who wore his humanity like armor, knowing it could not save him. His life was not a tale of conquest, but of conscience. And in his quiet strength, he reminded both gods and mortals that nobility does not require victory, only steadfastness. Hector was not remembered because he won. He was remembered because he stood, because he loved, and because he did not turn away when the world asked too much. Patroclus was not the strongest of warriors, nor the most cunning of men. He was not born of gods, nor destined by prophecy, yet he stands in the heart of the Trojan War like a silent flame, soft but impossible to ignore. His name echoes not through the number of lives he claimed, but through the depth of one life he changed. He was the companion of Achilles, the one soul who could steady the hero's storm, the only voice that could soften a rage too large for the world. Their bond began in childhood, shaped by exile and forged in the shared silence of boys cast out and misunderstood. While others saw Achilles' power, Patroclus saw the boy beneath the armor, the weight beneath the gold, and Achilles in turn saw in Patroclus a mirror, not of himself, but of what he could never be: gentle, patient, good. In a world where men measured worth by blood spilled and kingdoms burned, Patroclus offered something rarer: kindness. He was not weak, but he chose compassion over cruelty, service over pride. As the Greeks warred beneath Troy's walls and Achilles fumed in his tent over the insult dealt by Agamemnon, it was Patroclus who watched the bodies fall and felt not glory, but grief. The Greeks begged Achilles to return, to save them from ruin, but the great warrior refused, trapped in his own hurt. Patroclus, moved not by pride but by love, asked instead to wear Achilles' armor, to take the field in his name, to become, if only briefly, the shadow that could inspire hope. He did not ask for permission to slay, only to protect, to drive back the tide so that fewer sons would die before their mothers could name them heroes. Achilles hesitated, torn between fear and trust, but finally agreed, handing over the armor that had become a symbol of salvation. Patroclus led the Myrmidons into battle not with the ferocity of his companion, but with conviction. The Trojans, believing Achilles had returned, faltered, and for a moment the tide turned. Patroclus did not stop at the ships. Carried by momentum, he chased the enemy back toward the gates of Troy. He was warned by the gods, urged to pull back, but he pressed on, not because he craved blood, but because he believed that to retreat would mean all was lost. In that belief, noble and naive, he met Hector. They fought not as equals, but as men trapped in stories written before they were born. Hector struck the fatal blow, and as Patroclus fell, he did not curse fate. He warned Hector that Achilles would come and that death would follow. When word reached Achilles, the world changed. He tore his hair, covered his face in ash, and screamed into the heavens. The loss was not merely of a friend, it was of a piece of himself, the only piece that tethered him to humanity. Patroclus had been his calm, his conscience, his light. And with that light extinguished, Achilles no longer feared death. He returned to battle not to win, but to avenge. The rage that followed was not heroic, it was devastating. And yet, in that devastation, the depth of Achilles' love became clear. It was not fleeting affection, nor camaraderie born of war. It was something older, deeper, a bond so complete that even the gods watched in silence. Patroclus was mourned like no other. His funeral pyre burned for days. Achilles held his body as if by doing so, he could delay the final parting. He refused to bury him until Hector had paid him blood. And when that was done, Achilles returned, weary and broken, and laid Patroclus to rest. But even then he asked that their ashes be mingled. He built not two tombs, but one, so that in death, as in life, they would not be parted. The Greeks who sang songs of glory and conquest fell silent when they spoke his name. For in Patroclus they saw not a warrior, but the cost of war. He was the reminder that behind every hero is someone who suffers, someone who softens the edges, someone who will be mourned long after the last spear is cast. To later poets, Patroclus became many things: a companion, a beloved, a soulmate. To Homer, he was the heart of the Iliad, the flame that ignited Achilles' fury, and the tenderness that made him human. He was not remembered for killing, but for being the reason a godlike man remembered how to feel. And though Troy fell and Achilles followed him into death, it was Patroclus who stood quietly at the center of it all. A whisper in the noise, a hand on a shoulder, the flame that lit the darkest war. The death of Achilles did not arrive like thunder, nor with the sound of swords clashing. It came softly like the final line of a prophecy spoken long ago, waiting only for the silence that follows rage. Achilles had returned to the battlefield after the death of Patroclus, and in his fury, Troy trembled. His armor, newly forged by Hephaestus, gleamed not with glory, but with vengeance. He struck down Hector, faced the gods themselves, and walked through blood as if it were a shallow stream. And yet, for all his strength, all his legend, Achilles was still a man. Mortal not in muscle, but in destiny. His mother Thetis had tried to protect him from it, dipping him in the river Styx, leaving only his heel untouched, not out of neglect, but because no protection is ever perfect. And it was there, in that smallest space, that fate waited patiently. Paris, the prince who had started the war with a golden apple and a stolen bride, was no match for Achilles in strength. But war does not reward strength alone. With Apollo guiding his hand, Paris drew his bow and loosed an arrow. It flew not by skill, but by design. It found the heel, the single vulnerable point, and buried itself in skin that had never before been broken. Achilles fell, not like a warrior in battle, but like something sacred returning to the earth. The ground did not shake. The sky did not cry. But those who saw it knew that something irreplaceable had ended. The man who had terrified gods and defeated death for so long had succumbed to the one thing no warrior can escape: the truth that every story, even a divine one, must close. There was no triumph in his fall. The Greeks did not cheer. The Trojans did not rejoice. Even those who hated him felt the weight of his death. Achilles had been more than a warrior. He had been a force, a presence that filled the silence between battles. With him gone, the war seemed suddenly colder, more mechanical, less myth and more tragedy. His body was retrieved by Ajax and Odysseus, two of the mightiest left among the Greeks, and brought back to the ships. Thetis emerged from the sea, mourning not with wails, but with a silence that could drown mountains. She held her son's body, not as a god holds a fallen champion, but as a mother holds a child she can no longer protect. The funeral of Achilles was a thing of somber majesty. The Greeks built a pyre so high it seemed to scrape the sky. They burned him with the honors of a king, with sacrifices and songs, with armor and tears. His ashes were mingled with those of Patroclus, just as he had wished, so that even in death they would not be separated. A great mound was raised over their remains, and poets would say that the birds flew differently over that place, slower, more careful, as if not to disturb the sleep of legends. Yet even as they honored him, the war raged on. For war does not pause for mourning, Even when the greatest among the dead lies still, the Greeks quarreled over who would inherit Achilles' armor, a prize now heavy with meaning. Ajax and Odysseus both claimed it. And though Ajax's strength was unmatched, it was Odysseus's words that won. In despair, Ajax would take his own life. Another hero lost not to battle, but to pride. Achilles had known his fate. It had been told to him before he sailed to Troy that he could choose a long life in obscurity or a short one in glory. He chose glory, not out of vanity, but because he understood the kind of legacy he wanted to leave. And he left it, not just in the battles he won or the enemies he felled, but in the grief he inspired, in the void he left behind. The gods may have shaped him, but it was his choices that made him unforgettable. He chose to fight for honor, then for friendship, then for vengeance. And in the end, he chose to remain, knowing that death waited. There was no retreat, no last-minute escape. Just the quiet certainty that his story, however brief, would outlive empires. Later poets would struggle with his image. Was Achilles a hero or a warning? A demigod brought low by fate? Or a man who soared too close to the divine? Perhaps he was both. Perhaps he was neither. But what is certain is that after his death, the war was never the same. The songs grew darker, the battles more bitter. Without Achilles, the Greeks lost not only their greatest warrior, but their sense of invincibility. They were reminded, brutally and without ceremony, that even the brightest flame can be snuffed out by a single breath of fate. And though many more would die before the war ended, none would be mourned like Achilles. His name lived on not just in epic poetry, but in the way silence fell whenever it was spoken. Children would grow up hearing of his deeds, and men would measure themselves against his impossible shadow. But no one would ever be him. Achilles did not become a god. He became something rarer, a man who chose how he would be remembered, and who accepted the price of that memory without hesitation. The fall of Troy did not come with a shout, but with a whisper wrapped in wood. After 10 years of war, the walls that had once seemed impenetrable were still standing, though the hearts behind them were crumbling. The Greeks had tried every strategy, siege, battle, trickery, and brute force, and yet Troy endured. But where swords failed, stories took root. And so they left a gift, a horse towering and hollow, offered not as threat, but as tribute. The Greeks pretended to retreat, burning their camps, sailing away, leaving behind only that wooden beast. To the Trojans, it seemed at first a miracle, a sign that the war was over and that the gods had finally smiled upon them. Inside, some doubted. Laocoon, a priest, warned against it, cast a spear at its side, begged them not to trust gifts from enemies. But then the sea sent serpents to kill him and his sons, and the people, frightened and desperate for peace, believed the gods had silenced his blasphemy. The horse was pulled through the gates. It was the last decision Troy would make. That night, the city celebrated. Fires danced in the streets. Wine flowed like rivers. Families who had lived in fear for a decade finally let themselves laugh. Children who had grown up with the sound of spears learned for a moment what silence felt like. And in that stillness, as the stars turned above, and the people of Troy dreamed of mornings without war, the trap was sprung. From the belly of the horse came Greek warriors, silent, efficient, merciless. Among them was Odysseus, whose mind had shaped the deception, and Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, who carried his father's legacy like a sword. They opened the gates from within, and the Greek army, which had only pretended to sail away, returned under the cover of night. The city that had stood proud and defiant for a generation awoke to fire. There was no battle, only slaughter. The streets ran red, not with the glory of combat, but with the grief of helplessness. The temples burned, the palaces crumbled, and in the chaos, no one was spared. Priam, old and bent by loss, was killed on the altar where he had sought sanctuary. His wife, Hecuba, would be dragged into slavery. Cassandra, the cursed prophet who had always spoken truth and never been believed, screamed of doom even as she was pulled away. Andromache, Hector's widow, clutched her son Astyanax as the Greeks debated his fate. A child barely old enough to speak, thrown from the walls so he could not grow to avenge his father. The fall of Troy was not a clash of heroes. It was the final cruelty of a war that had long since stopped pretending to be noble. Helen, whose face had launched the 1,000 ships, watched the city burn from its highest tower. Some say she mourned, others say she felt relief. Menelaus, her husband, found her amid the ruin and chose to take her back, whether out of love, pity, or a need to possess what had caused such a destruction. No poet ever agreed on her guilt. Perhaps that is the point. In war, blame is easier than understanding. The Greeks took what they could, gold, slaves, stories, and left nothing behind but ash and silence. Troy, which had stood for centuries, was gone in a single night. And yet the fall of Troy was not an end. It was a beginning. Aeneas, a prince of the city, escaped with his father and young son, guided by the gods. He carried with him the hopes of a people who had lost everything. His journey would inspire new myths, new empires, as Rome one day would rise from the ashes of Ilium. But the memory of Troy lingered, not just in stories, but in the haunted eyes of those who had survived. The war had begun over beauty, over pride, over promises wrapped in golden lies. It ended not with justice, but with a reminder that no city, no king, no hero is safe from the weight of fate when pride outpaces wisdom. The gods who once played among mortals grew quiet. Their games had cost too much. And in that silence, the poets began to write. They did not write of conquest, but of consequence. Not of glory, but of grief. And through their verses, Troy lived on. Not as a place, but as a warning. The horse stood not only at the gates of a city, but at the edge of every story men would tell to justify war. Fire, horse, and silence. That was all that remained. And yet somehow it was enough to echo forever. Odysseus was never the strongest among the Greeks, nor the swiftest, nor the most beautiful. His fame did not come from the number of men he slew or the gods he pleased. It came from something subtler, something more dangerous. The mind that would not rest. Where others charged with swords drawn, Odysseus waited in shadow. Where kings shouted commands, he listened. His thoughts twisted like smoke, curling through possibility, shaping futures not through force, but through foresight. It was his mind that had given the Greeks their victory, not through valor on the battlefield, but with the simple shape of a wooden horse. And yet, for all his cleverness, he was never truly at peace. The same mind that saved his comrades would torment him for years to come, long after the last spear had fallen silent at Troy. When the fires had died down and the wind returned to the sails of Greek ships, most warriors looked homeward with longing. Odysseus, too, yearned for Ithaca, his island kingdom, his loyal wife Penelope, his infant son Telemachus, who had grown up in his absence. But the gods, especially Poseidon, had other plans. For blinding the Cyclops Polyphemus, the sea god's son, Odysseus earned divine wrath. His journey home became not a voyage, but a trial. Years stretched like decades. His men, one by one, were lost to storms, to hunger, to monsters, and to their own poor choices. And all the while, Odysseus endured, driven not by glory but by memory, by the fading sound of Penelope's voice, the imagined weight of his son's hand in his own. He faced enchantresses who offered pleasure and forgetfulness, like Circe, who turned his men to swine and offered him her bed. He stayed not out of weakness, but out of calculation, knowing that survival sometimes wears a softer face. He descended into the underworld to seek counsel among the dead, speaking with the ghost of Tiresias, learning not of shortcuts but of inevitability. He passed the sirens, whose songs lured sailors to their deaths, but he did not silence them. He listened, bound to the mast, ears open and body restrained, not to give in, but to understand. In every danger, Odysseus did not conquer. He endured. His mind bent around obstacles the way rivers bend around stone, never stopping, never resting. But cleverness has a cost. His men, worn and homesick, often grew impatient with his caution, his tricks, his delays. When they reached the island where the cattle of the sun god grazed, he warned them not to touch a single beast. Hunger overpowered reason, and they slaughtered what was forbidden. For that, Zeus sent the storm that killed them all, and Odysseus alone was left clinging to driftwood, tossed across the sea like a forgotten name. He washed ashore on the island of Calypso, a nymph who offered him immortality and love, asking only that he abandon his quest for home. But even eternity meant nothing to Odysseus if it came at the price of Ithaca. For 7 years he lingered, not out of desire, but out of captivity. And when the gods finally relented, he set sail once more, weary but unbroken. At home, Penelope had waited, not with tears, but with quiet defiance. Suitors filled her halls, eating her food, mocking her faith, demanding her hand. She wove a burial shroud by day and unraveled it by night, a lie spun in thread, buying time for a husband whose face had faded from memory. Telemachus, now a man, searched the world for a father he barely knew. And then one day, an old beggar came to Ithaca, bent and dusty, unrecognizable. Odysseus did not storm his house with sword raised. He watched. He waited. He planned. For even after years adrift, his mind was still sharp. When the time came, he revealed himself not with words but with arrows, stringing his old bow with ease and striking down the men who had devoured his name. His reunion with Penelope was not a roar of passion. It was a quiet, cautious moment. Two people shaped by time and pain, recognizing each other not by sight but by memory. She tested him, as she should have, and he answered not with flattery, but with truth. The bed that could not be moved, carved from the roots of a tree, that was his answer, and her proof. Odysseus was home, not as a hero, but as a husband, a father, a man changed by sorrow and distance. His victory was not over Troy. It was over himself, over the temptation to forget, to surrender, to rest too soon. To the poets, Odysseus became a symbol of endurance, not the brightest flame, but the one that flickers longest. His story is not about triumph without cost, but about the burden of cleverness, the loneliness of the thinker, the weariness of those who must always be 3 steps ahead. He did not slay dragons or build empires, he survived. And in doing so, he gave voice to a different kind of hero, one who returns scarred and wiser and finds that even after gods and monsters, the hardest thing to rebuild is the life he left behind. While the world remembers the roar of warriors and the clash of gods, it is in the quiet rooms and candlelit chambers that some of the greatest heroism lives. Penelope, wife of Odysseus, did not ride into battle or outwit monsters. She did not hold a sword or seek the favor of Olympus. Yet her name stands alongside the mightiest of Greek myth, not for what she conquered, but for what she refused to abandon. Left behind in Ithaca, as Odysseus sailed to Troy, Penelope knew war would last long, but not how long loneliness could stretch. Years passed without word, and then more years still. Most would have surrendered to grief, remarried for protection, or simply forgotten. But Penelope, with hands steadier than fate and a mind sharper than many kings, chose patience. She waited not in stillness, but in quiet resistance. When suitors crowded her halls, feasting upon her stores and demanding her hand, she did not scream or flee. She wove. She promised to choose a new husband only after finishing a burial shroud for Odysseus's father Laertes. And each night, she unraveled her work thread by thread, erasing the day's progress in darkness. The lie became legend. The loom became her sword. It was a war of hours and fabric, of subtle rebellion disguised as domestic labor. The suitors grew suspicious, of course, but her calm and sorrow shielded her. To them, she was a woman caught in ritual. But to those who looked deeper, she was a fortress of will, defending not a kingdom, but a memory. Penelope did not know if Odysseus still lived. The sea devours certainty. Stories came of his death, of strange lands and stranger creatures, of gods and tempests. Each tale chipped away at hope, but never fully shattered it. She held to the idea that he would return, not because she was naive, but because she understood him. She knew his mind, his restlessness, his love masked by caution, and she knew that if any man could carve his way home through myth and misfortune, it would be him. Yet hope, when stretched across decades, becomes brittle. And still, she endured. She raised their son alone, guided him with the same patience she offered the world, and taught him not through fear, but by example, that silence can be strength, and that dignity is a form of defiance. As Telemachus grew, he too began to question the past. Who was this father he had never met? Was he a legend or a lie? Penelope answered not with grandeur, but with steadiness. She did not fill his head with fire, but with firmness. When he sought answers, she did not stop him. She let him go, trusting that if his father still breathed, he would find him. And if not, then Telemachus would return stronger for the search. The suitors, sensing the boy's growing courage, pressed harder. They mocked Penelope's grief, called her cruel for clinging to a ghost, for keeping the throne empty while the kingdom frayed. But she stood firm. Her power was not in command, but in conviction. Each meal she served them became a gesture of control, a queen serving intruders, not out of surrender, but out of strategy. When Odysseus returned at last, it was not to fanfare or recognition. Disguised as a beggar, he moved through the halls unseen. Penelope, wise beyond mourning, did not weep or rush into his arms. She tested, not out of doubt, but because only the real Odysseus could know what they had built together. The secret of their bed, carved from the roots of a living olive tree, was her final line of defense. And when he spoke of it, not as myth, but as memory, she knew. Their reunion was not an explosion of passion, but a slow, quiet collapse of years apart. In his arms, she did not find rescue. She found return. The war had ended not when Troy fell, but when she could finally stop unweaving. Penelope's name over time became synonymous with loyalty, but that word, often spoken lightly, does her no justice. Her loyalty was not blind. It was not submission. It was chosen every day against pressure, against grief, against the ease of forgetting. She stood in the same palace halls day after day, not because she was trapped, but because she believed that endurance can be sacred. In a world of gods who toy with men and kings who burn for fame, Penelope reminded us that sometimes the greatest hero is the one who waits, who believes, who weaves and unweaves until truth returns. The bards sang of Achilles' wrath and Odysseus' wit, of battles and beasts and divine rage. But beneath those louder tales runs a quieter thread. Penelope's thread, steady and true, holding the tapestry together while the world frayed at the edges. Her story is not one of war, but of refusal, not to bend, not to forget, not to trade love for convenience. And in that refusal, she became a myth of her own, a woman whose strength needed no armor, whose silence spoke louder than any hero's roar. Telemachus was born into absence. His father, Odysseus, sailed for war when the boy was still cradled in his mother's arms, leaving behind more than a home. He left behind a question. For 20 years, that question hung over Telemachus like a shadow at noon. He grew up in a house half full, where the throne was occupied by silence and the halls echoed not with command, but with uncertainty. Penelope did not speak often of her husband, but in the way she looked out at the sea, in the way she unraveled her weaving by candlelight, Telemachus learned of loyalty and sorrow before he learned to speak of heroism. He did not remember Odysseus's voice, but he remembered the shape of longing. And in that memory, shaped not by presence, but by waiting, the boy became something else. Part son, part heir, and part guardian of a myth not yet finished. As he grew older, Telemachus watched his home slowly rot under the weight of suitors. They ate not only his family's food, but the dignity of the house itself. They treated his mother's silence as weakness and his inexperience as an invitation. But Telemachus, though young, was not unformed. His mother's quiet strength had settled in him like roots. He spoke little, but watched everything. He did not strike out blindly or fall into rage. Instead, he waited for the moment when silence would no longer suffice. That moment came when Athena, cloaked in disguise, appeared to him with the kind of guidance only gods bestow. She did not hand him courage, but reminded him it already lay within him. He would not find his father by staying behind. He would only become himself by stepping into the world that had once shaped Odysseus. And so, Telemachus set sail, not in search of conquest, but in search of answers. He traveled to Pylos, to Sparta, to the courts of kings who remembered the war that had made and broken so many. They spoke of Odysseus with both awe and doubt, for it had been too long since his name had rung clearly. And in these stories, Telemachus began to assemble the pieces of the man he had never known. Not a god, not a ghost, but a man, clever, proud, tired, and terribly human. And as Telemachus listened, he realized he was not merely seeking his father, but the shape of the man he himself might become. In learning of Odysseus, he was measuring himself against the unreachable and discovering in the process that he did not need to match it, only to understand it. When he returned to Ithaca, the boy who had left was no longer the same. He no longer waited for rescue, he acted. And when Odysseus returned in disguise, it was Telemachus who stood closest, not in recognition, but in readiness. When his father revealed himself, it was not with disbelief that Telemachus responded, but with a quiet, stunned acceptance. The myth had walked into his life, not as a tale told by others, but as blood and breath. And yet, even in reunion, there was no collapse into sentiment. Father and son stood as strangers, shaped by similar shadows. They did not speak of lost years. They spoke of plans. Together, they prepared to reclaim what had been stolen. Not just a household, but a name. When the suitors fell by Odysseus' arrows, Telemachus stood beside him, not as a child behind a shield, but as an equal in resolve. He did not crave violence, but he understood necessity. The cleansing of their home was not just revenge, but restoration. And when the halls were finally silent again, when Penelope wept not from grief but release, Telemachus stood in the center of it all, a boy no longer. He had inherited not just a kingdom, but a legacy shaped by gods, grief, and waiting. And though the stories would always sing louder of his father, it was Telemachus who had guarded the hearth, who had protected the thread of hope long enough for the myth to find its way home. He would go on to rule Ithaca one day, though that story is seldom told. Perhaps because peace is a quieter tale, and kings who do not chase war leave fewer scars upon history. But in the stillness that followed the return, Telemachus became what every son of legend must one day become. Not an echo, but a voice. His inheritance was not just a throne or a name, but the memory of restraint, the wisdom to know when to act and when to endure. And in that, he carried not only the blood of Odysseus, but the heart of Penelope, a hero shaped not by the gods, but by the long, slow patience of waiting. In the final night of Troy, when fire licked the walls and screams tangled with smoke, there was a man who did not search for vengeance or victory, but for a way forward. Aeneas, son of Anchises and the goddess Aphrodite, was not the greatest warrior of his age, nor the most cunning, but he carried within him something rarer than strength, a sense of purpose not bound to the present. While others perished in rage or desperation, Aeneas turned his eyes to what might still be saved. He did not die defending the past. He chose instead to carry it, smoldering and broken, into the uncertainty of dawn. As Troy crumbled, he lifted his aged father upon his back, took his son by the hand, and walked through fire not as a victim, but as a vessel. Aeneas did not flee out of cowardice, but out of conviction. He knew that honor could live beyond ruins, that memory could grow roots in foreign soil. With a small band of survivors, he took to the sea, guided by omens and visions that whispered of a new homeland far away. The gods did not offer clarity, only direction. They pointed west. And so Aeneas sailed, not toward conquest, but toward destiny. Though he barely understood what that meant, he passed islands haunted by sirens, lands ruled by reluctant hosts, and cities that offered refuge wrapped in chains. At every shore, he had to decide whether to settle or to keep moving. And each time, he chose movement, because the future he was meant to plant had not yet revealed its soil. Not all companions endured. Some fell to sickness, others to sorrow. Aeneas mourned but did not stop. He became a leader not by decree but by example, shouldering grief and decision with the same steady silence. His journey was not swift. It meandered like a river uncertain of its end. At Carthage, he found warmth in Queen Dido's arms, and for a moment it seemed the past could be forgotten. But the gods, always watchful, reminded him that duty rarely makes room for comfort. He left, not with cruelty, but with sorrow, and behind him Dido perished in flame, a queen undone not by betrayal, but by the unbearable weight of unchosen fate. Her curse would linger, casting a long shadow over Rome's future, though Aeneas could not yet know it. At last he reached the shores of Italy, not with triumph, but with weariness. The land was not empty. Others already called it home. There was no welcome, only resistance. But Aeneas, shaped by years of endurance, no longer feared struggle. He did not seek to erase the people he found, but to join with them, to build something rooted in both memory and change. He courted Lavinia, daughter of King Latinus, not as a conqueror, but as a partner. Yet war came, as it always does when the future is being born. Turnus, Lavinia's former suitor, raised arms against him. The fighting was fierce, not glorious. Aeneas fought not for pride, but because peace sometimes comes only after fire. In the end, Aeneas killed Turnus, not in rage, but in recognition that some doors cannot be left open. His hands, once devoted to rescue and rebuilding, had become instruments of finality. And with that act, the path to a new city was cleared. He did not live to see Rome, but he laid its first stone, not in marble, but in myth. His son Ascanius, also called Iulus, would carry his line forward. And in generations to come, the Romans would look back not only to Romulus and Remus, but further still, to the man who carried his father through flame and never stopped walking. Aeneas was never a god, but he was more than a man. He was a bridge between fallen Troy and rising Rome, between grief and hope, between what had been lost and what might still be made. The poets who sang of him did not praise his conquests. They praised his burden. In him, they saw the quiet power of endurance, of carrying history without being crushed by it. And in the long corridors of time, where so many heroes shine for a moment and vanish, Aeneas remains, steady, unspectacular, and unforgettable. A reminder that sometimes the greatest legacy is not left in the fire one lights, but in the ashes one refuses to abandon. Long after the fires of Troy had turned to myth, and Aeneas had vanished into the folds of legend, the world turned its quiet gaze toward the banks of the Tiber. There, where the river curved like a question mark in the earth, two infants were cast into the current, unwanted by men, preserved by fate. Romulus and Remus, twin sons of the Vestal Virgin Rhea Silvia and the god Mars, were born into danger. Their birth was not celebrated, but hidden, for their existence threatened the throne of their great-uncle Amulius, who had usurped power from their grandfather, King Numitor. To protect his rule, Amulius ordered the twins to be drowned, trusting the river to carry out his will. But the river, unlike kings, had no interest in politics. It carried the children gently to the roots of a wild fig tree, where they came to rest, not among men, but beneath the watchful eyes of a she-wolf. She found them hungry and crying, and without hesitation, she gave them life. Her milk nourished their bodies, her warmth gave them breath. For a time, they knew no other mother than this beast of the forest. Later, a shepherd named Faustulus would take them in, raise them with his wife, and teach them the ways of man. But it was the she-wolf's cave, the Lupercal, that remained etched into their blood. They grew not as princes, but as children of wilderness and survival. They learned the rhythms of earth before the rules of court. Their strength came not from inheritance, but from instinct. And when they learned the truth of their origins, that they were sons of a royal line, stolen from power, they did not weep. They rose. Together they overthrew Amulius, restored Numitor to the throne of Alba Longa, and refused the safety of established rule. The wildness in them, inherited from wolves and rivers and hidden roots, would not be content with serving another man's court. They sought to build something of their own, a city, a future, a name. They returned to the bend of the river where fate had first spared them and marked the land as sacred. But blood, even when shared, is not always enough to bind. As they began to plan their city, a question arose that has broken many before them. Who would rule? Romulus claimed the Palatine Hill, Remus claimed the Aventine. They sought signs from the gods, auguries of birds and omens in the sky. But signs are often as cruel as they are cryptic. Remus saw 6 vultures, Romulus saw 12. One claimed precedence in time, the other in number. The dispute, like a storm gathering behind calm skies, escalated without pause. Words failed, blood followed. In a moment that would echo across centuries, Romulus struck down his brother. Some say it was in a fit of rage. Others say it was a calculated blow. Remus fell beside the city he would never see built, and Romulus stood over him, silent. He had won, but at what cost? He would name the city Rome after himself, but it would always carry the shadow of a brother lost, a throne gained not through fate alone, but through fratricide. Romulus became the first king of Rome, shaping the bones of a city that would one day rule an empire. He welcomed outcasts, exiles, and fugitives, declaring his new city a refuge for those who had nowhere else to turn. The people who gathered were not polished nor noble. They were thieves, shepherds, wanderers. But Romulus saw not their pasts, only their potential. To provide wives for his people, he orchestrated the abduction of the Sabine women, not as a mere act of conquest, but as a calculated gamble to force unity through shared blood. War followed, but so too did reconciliation. The Sabine women, caught between fathers and husbands, chose peace. And so Rome was not born of purity, but of contradiction, violence and diplomacy, loss and compromise. Romulus ruled for many years. His authority sometimes praised, sometimes feared. He shaped institutions, divided tribes, and laid foundations, not just in stone, but in law. But the man who had risen from wolf's milk and river's mercy was never meant to fade quietly. In time, stories claim that he vanished in a storm, taken up to the heavens by Mars himself, ascending not as a king, but as a god. The Romans would worship him as Quirinus, a divine guardian of the city he had founded with blood. His end, like his beginning, was shrouded in mystery. Some whispered that he was torn apart by the senators, his body scattered like secrets. But the myth preferred something grander, that Romulus had simply transcended. And so Rome began, not in peace, but in paradox. Born of divine blood and human frailty, of twin brothers who could not share a crown, of laws forged through violence and vision. Romulus gave the city his name, But it was Remus who gave it its soul. For every wall raised in Rome, there was a memory of the brother who might have walked beside it. In the silent spaces between legends, his absence echoed louder than any triumph. The empire would rise, stretch across continents, echo in marble and sword. But beneath it all, there remained the tale of two brothers and the line of blood that ran from cradle to crown. In the quiet corners of Greek myth, where war cries fade and gods step back into shadow, there is the sound of music, soft, unyielding, and mournful. It belongs to Orpheus, a man not known for sword or shield, but for the lyre in his hands and the grief in his heart. Born of the muse Calliope and a Thracian king, Orpheus was not destined to conquer cities or command armies. His gift was different, more dangerous in its own way, for it moved not bodies, but hearts. His melodies could charm animals, coax trees to lean, and coax rivers to still their flow. Even the stones, unmoved by war or prayer, bent slightly toward his song. His fame spread not through victories, but through harmony, until one day his music met silence. Her name was Eurydice. She was not a goddess, not a queen, not a prize. She was simply beloved. Orpheus loved her not with fanfare, but with depth. Their union was quiet, without divine spectacle or epic tale, and perhaps that is why it hurt more when she died, bitten by a serpent, collapsing before their story could even begin. The world did not pause. The sun still rose, but Orpheus stopped. His music, once vibrant and overflowing, turned into something hollow and raw. He sang not to charm, but to plead. And in that pleading, he made a decision no mortal had dared with hope in their heart. He would descend into the underworld and bring her back. The road to Hades is not a path, but a surrender. Orpheus walked through twilight, past ghosts and shadows, his lyre the only light. When he reached the gates of the underworld, guarded by Cerberus, it was not brute force that carried him through. It was music. A single note stretched into a lamentation, softened even the teeth of monsters. He passed through fields of mourning and shores of forgetfulness, until he stood before Hades and Persephone, king and queen of the dead. He did not bargain with gold or threats. He simply played. His song was not one of love, but of loss. It did not demand, it remembered. The underworld listened. Shades paused in their eternal drift. Sisyphus rested his stone. Tantalus forgot his thirst. Even the Furies, born of vengeance, wept into their hands. When the final note faded, silence fell like ash. And Hades, unmoved by centuries of grief, gave one of the rarest gifts in all myth: permission. Eurydice could follow Orpheus back to the living world, but only if he did not look back, not once, until both had crossed the threshold. No reason was given, only the condition. A test of faith or a cruelty veiled in rules. Orpheus accepted. He turned and walked, his steps echoing softly in the damp halls of the dead. Behind him he could not hear Eurydice, for the dead make no sound. The journey was long, and each step deeper into light became heavier with doubt. Was she truly there? Was it a trick? Had Hades changed his mind? As the mouth of the cave came into view, the silence behind him grew unbearable. Just a few more steps. But silence, when laced with love, becomes a weight few can bear. Orpheus turned. For the briefest moment he saw her, whole, beautiful, reaching, and then fading. Eurydice was pulled back into shadow, not with violence, but with the inevitability of falling leaves. No scream, no curse, just a gaze that said everything and forgave too much. Orpheus, broken, emerged into the world alone again. He did not scream, he did not sing. The lyre hung silent at his side, its strings untouched. He wandered not with purpose, but with memory. Some say he swore off the love of women. Others say he sang to the trees until they wept sap. But most agree he never truly returned from that descent. His death came not with glory, but with madness. The Maenads, frenzied followers of Dionysus, tore him limb from limb, not out of hatred, but because even his silence disrupted their chaos. His head, still singing, floated down the river Hebrus, whispering Eurydice's name until it reached the sea. And his lyre, the very vessel of his soul, was cast into the heavens, where it still hangs as a constellation. A quiet reminder that even in myth, not all songs end with triumph. Some end in echo. Orpheus remains one of the few heroes of Greek myth who fought not with blade, but with beauty. He did not slay monsters, he did not claim thrones, but he dared to ask for the impossible and was punished not for arrogance, but for humanity. His tale is not about victory, but about the ache of almost. He teaches us that love does not conquer death, but it remembers. And in remembering, it makes the dead live again, even if only in the tremble of a string or the silence that follows. Before he was a god, before he was a constellation, before his name became a symbol of brute strength, Heracles was a boy born into the shadow of Hera's hatred. He was the son of Zeus and the mortal woman Alcmene, and for that alone, the queen of Olympus saw him as a stain upon her honor. Hera did not strike him down directly, for the gods rarely act with haste. Instead, she laid traps in the folds of time, placing madness in his path and sorrow in his home. As a child, Heracles strangled serpents sent to his crib. As a man, he would face monsters of far greater cunning, but none more cruel than the madness that would one day possess him and turn his strength inward. That madness, whispered into him by Hera's will, made him slaughter his own wife and children, not in rage, but in confusion. And when clarity returned, it did not bring comfort, only unbearable grief. Seeking purification, Heracles turned to the oracle of Delphi, and the gods, in their ancient logic, did not offer forgiveness, only labor. He was commanded to serve King Eurystheus of Tyrans, a petty ruler with no greatness but much authority. From this king, Heracles would receive 12 impossible tasks, not to glorify him, but to weigh him down, to see if redemption could rise from humiliation. These were not heroic quests in the usual sense. They were trials of endurance, violence, and will. And though Heracles was stronger than any man, it was not his strength alone that would carry him through, but his ability to return from each task without letting the darkness consume him again. The first labor sent him to slay the Nemean lion, a beast whose hide could not be pierced by any blade. Heracles wrestled it with his bare hands, strangling the creature, then skinned it using its own claw. From then on, he wore the lion's pelt as armor, not just against weapons, but against memory. Next came the Lernaean Hydra, a serpent with many heads, each of which grew back when severed. With the help of his nephew Iolaus, Heracles burned each stump to prevent regeneration and buried the immortal head beneath a rock. The third labor led him to capture the Ceryneian hind, a sacred deer swift as wind and untouchable by mortals. He pursued it for a year, never giving up, until he caught it at last. Not with violence, but with patience. He brought down the Erymanthian boar, cleaned the Augean stables in a single day by rerouting rivers, and drove off the Stymphalian birds with bronze noisemakers gifted by Athena. Each labor tested a different part of him, not just his muscle, but his wit, his restraint, his resolve. He captured the Cretan bull, stole the mares of Diomedes who feasted on human flesh, and took the belt of the Amazon Queen Hippolyta, a task that ended in blood despite his initial diplomacy. He seized the cattle of the monstrous Geryon, plucked the golden apples of the Hesperides with the help of Atlas, and finally descended into the underworld itself to bring back Cerberus, the three-headed guardian of Hades. He did not kill the beast. He simply led it into the light and then returned it. For not all victories require destruction. Each labor left marks upon his body and soul, He gained glory, yes, but never peace. Between tasks, he wandered. He drank deeply, loved briefly, fought often. He married again, to Deianira, but Hera's curse was patient. One day Deianira, fearing he loved another, gave him a cloak laced unknowingly with poison. When Heracles put it on, it clung to his skin like fire. Unable to bear the pain, he built a funeral pyre and lay upon it, asking his friend to light the wood. Flames rose and the mortal part of him burned away. But from that ash something else emerged. Zeus, perhaps out of guilt or pride, lifted him to Olympus and granted him immortality. Heracles became a god, not because he was flawless, but because he endured. In the heavens, he was reconciled even with Hera, who at last accepted him and gave him her daughter Hebe as wife. But it is not his godhood that people remember. It is the labors, the endless toil, the image of a man crushed by guilt and carrying the weight of forgiveness one task at a time. Heracles is remembered not for never falling, but for standing back up. His strength was not in his arms alone, but in his refusal to let his worst day define his last. And so his name became a metaphor not for perfection, but for perseverance. The Romans called him Hercules. Artists painted him, poets sang of him, and emperors claimed his blood. But in the silence between the stories, you can still find the man before the myth, a son abandoned by the gods, cursed by madness, redeemed not by mercy, but by labor. And in that story, mortals saw something of themselves, not divine wrath or epic glory, but struggle. Long, slow, relentless struggle. The kind that wears away the sharp edges of pain until only endurance remains. In the age when myths still breathe beside men, Athens knew fear, not of war, but of tribute. Every 9 years, the city sent 7 young men and 7 maidens across the sea to Crete, not to trade or wed, but to die. They were given as offerings to a beast hidden deep within a twisting maze, a punishment born of old war and older pride. At the heart of that terror waited the Minotaur, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull, born of a queen's desire and a god's cruelty. No one returned from the labyrinth, for it was not simply a prison, but a place where direction collapsed and reason unraveled. And yet, into that silence, a prince volunteered, not for glory, but to end the cycle. His name was Theseus. He was the son of Aegeus, king of Athens, though his childhood passed far from court. Hidden by his mother and raised in secret, Theseus only learned of his lineage when he was strong enough to lift a great stone beneath which his father had hidden sword and sandals. With those in hand, he journeyed to Athens, refusing the safe sea route in favor of land roads haunted by robbers and beasts. He did not avoid danger. He sought it, believing that justice must be claimed, not inherited. At every turn, he met those who preyed upon the weak and punished them not with mercy, but with mirrored cruelty. It was said he killed them as they killed others, as if justice required reenactment. By the time he arrived in Athens, he was not just a prince, but a legend. When he heard of the coming tribute to Crete, he did not waver. He stepped forward, asking to be among the chosen. Aegeus, torn between pride and fear, agreed only after Theseus promised to hoist white sails on his return, should he survive. The ship left with black sails raised, and the sea carried them not toward death, but toward destiny. In Crete, Theseus met Ariadne, daughter of King Minos, who saw in him not just bravery, but possibility. She gave him 2 gifts, a ball of thread to trace his path within the labyrinth, and a heart willing to betray her bloodline. That night, while the others trembled, Theseus stepped into the maze. Inside, there was no light. The air was thick with the smell of stone and rot. Each turn led to more turns. Time uncoiled. Theseus moved forward, guided by the thread in his hand and the resolve in his spine. When the Minotaur found him, it did not speak. It charged. The battle was not witnessed. There are no songs for the clash. Only that when morning came, Theseus emerged, bloodied but unbroken, dragging a thread that led the others to freedom. He had slain the beast not just for Athens, but for all who had been forgotten within the walls of fear. He did not celebrate. He simply left. He fled Crete with Ariadne, but did not keep her. On the island of Naxos, he left her sleeping. Why he did so, the myths disagree. Some say Dionysus claimed her. Others say Theseus saw in her too much of the betrayal that allowed him to win. Still others whisper that he feared what love would demand of a man who had always lived for duty. Regardless, she woke alone, and he sailed on, silent. When he reached the coast of Athens, he forgot, or perhaps could not bear, to change the sails. From the cliff, Aegis saw black against the sky, and believing his son dead, cast himself into the sea that would forever bear his name. Theseus returned not as a hero, but as a king. He united the tribes of Attica, founded the Isthmian Games, and gave Athens a new age. But his life did not quiet. He married the Amazon queen Antiope, and later Phaedra. His friend Pirithous dragged him into dangerous quests. His sons would grow distant, and slowly the city he saved grew wary of the man who had once walked into the labyrinth. His end came not with a blade, but with exile. Cast from his own land, he found refuge on the island of Skyros. There, betrayed by a host or by fate, he fell from a cliff into the sea. No songs mark his death. No temples bore his name for centuries. He vanished not as a legend, but as a man too complicated to fit within one. Yet the thread he followed remains. In every tale of courage, of stepping into darkness with nothing but a hope and a way back, there is Theseus, not perfect, not blameless, but brave. He reminds us that monsters are not always beasts and mazes are not always made of stone. Sometimes they live inside us, and victory is simply the act of walking through and returning, not unchanged, but alive. In the kingdom of Iolcus, where the sea whispered stories to the stone shore, and mountains brooded in quiet judgment, a boy named Jason was born with a kingdom in his blood and none beneath his feet. His father Aeson had once been king, but was overthrown by his half-brother Peleus, who seized the throne and scattered the rightful heir into obscurity. Jason was hidden away, raised by the wise centaur Chiron, far from politics and ambition. There he learned the arts not of kingship, but of balance, medicine, music, archery, silence. Yet time always calls its heirs home, and one day Jason descended the slopes of Mount Pelion, a grown man with sandaled feet in a single sandal lost, crossing a swollen river while aiding a disguised goddess. That missing sandal, unnoticed by him, marked him for fate, for an oracle had warned Peleus that a man with one sandal would be his undoing. Jason arrived in Iolcus not with a sword raised, but with calm certainty. He demanded the throne not with threats, but with lineage. Peleus, cunning and aged, agreed, but not without condition. If Jason wished to rule, he must first retrieve the Golden Fleece, a relic of divine history guarded in the distant land of Colchis. It was a task meant to destroy him, not reward him. But Jason, perhaps naive, or perhaps already resigned to struggle, accepted without pause. The fleece had once belonged to a magical ram sent by the gods to rescue two children from a false sacrifice. Its skin shimmered gold, hung in a sacred grove, and was guarded by a sleepless dragon. Yet Jason did not intend to go alone. He summoned the greatest heroes of Greece, Heracles, Orpheus, Atalanta, Castor, and Pollux, and many more. Each one a name sung by poets and feared by monsters. Together they built a ship, the Argo, guided by a prophetic beam carved from the sacred oak of Dodona. They set sail not as conquerors, but as seekers, their voyage a thread through lands unknown and trials unending. The journey was not a straight line, but a spiral through myth. They passed Lemnos, an island ruled entirely by women where desire nearly delayed their purpose. They faced the Harpies who tormented the prophet Phineas, and in return for freeing him, gained knowledge of how to navigate the clashing rocks, two towering cliffs that crushed ships in their embrace. By releasing a dove and watching it pass unharmed, they learned the timing needed to survive. Finally, they reached Colchis, land of flame and shadow, where the fleece hung not as a prize but as a warning. King Aeetes, keeper of the fleece, agreed to grant it, but only if Jason completed 3 impossible tasks. He must yoke fire-breathing bulls, plow a field with them, sow it with dragon's teeth, and defeat the warriors that would rise from the soil. It was not a challenge, it was a trap. But fate, ever tangled, intervened. Medea, daughter of Aeetes and priestess of Hecate, saw Jason and loved him, not with reason, but with the full force of divine inheritance and human ache. She gave him salves to protect against flame, advice to defeat the earthborn men, and finally sleep spells to lull the dragon that guarded the fleece. Jason completed the tasks, took the fleece, and fled with Medea into the night. The return voyage was marked not by triumph, but by pursuit and sorrow. Aeetes gave chase. To slow him, Medea performed a terrible act. She dismembered her own brother, scattering his limbs in the sea, forcing their father to stop and gather the remains. The Argo moved on, heavy with guilt. The gods did not look kindly on such sacrifice, and the crew faced storm, hunger, madness. They wandered to the ends of the known world, passed between Scylla and Charybdis, sought purification for murder. At long last, they returned to Iolcus. Jason brought the fleece before Peleus, but the king, unyielding and unmoved, still clung to his throne. In response, Medea tricked his daughters into killing him, convincing them that they could restore his youth through dark rites. The throne was taken, but not kept. The couple was exiled, and Jason's reign never began. They fled to Corinth, where peace eroded. Jason's ambition grew, and his love for Medea waned. He sought to marry the daughter of the local king to gain stability and power. Medea, betrayed, struck back not with words, but with vengeance that still chills the bones of myth. She killed the princess and her father with a poisoned gift, and then, in an act that tore the sky in half, murdered her own children by Jason. Not out of hatred for them, but to leave him truly alone. She fled in a chariot drawn by dragons. Jason shattered, never ruled, never recovered. He became a relic in his own life, haunted by decisions he once mistook for victories. Years passed. The Argo, once shining, rotted on the shore. Jason returned to sit beneath its broken hull, alone. And there, beneath the beam of prophecy, the ship collapsed. The sacred timber fell upon him, ending his story not in battle, but in quiet ruin. He died nameless, king of nothing, remembered more for loss than triumph. The golden fleece, the journey, the heroics, they faded beneath the weight of what followed. Yet his voyage remains not as a tale of conquest, but of what it costs to chase destiny, to love dangerously, to believe in glory without understanding grief. There is no war that ends mythology. No single battle or rebellion silences Olympus. The gods of Greece do not die with a crash or vanish in smoke. They fade slowly, imperceptibly, as the sea swallows sand and time smooths memory. Once Zeus reigned with thunder and judgment. Now his name lingers in stone inscriptions and weathered temples, known more to scholars than worshippers. Hera, who burned with vengeance, now rests in painted jars. Apollo no longer sings in Delphi, and Artemis's arrows rust in forgotten altars. There is no final clash, no exile to some distant realm. They simply stop speaking. The prayers stop rising, and in the silence, myth becomes history, then becomes story. The fall of the gods is not a moment, but a turning. As Rome rose and absorbed the gods into Latin tongues, their Greek names twisted and spread. Jupiter replaced Zeus, Venus replaced Aphrodite, but the pulse of belief had already slowed. The stories endured, yes, but not the devotion. The temples still stood, but they echoed. Oracles still spoke, but fewer listened. Slowly the divine became decoration. The gods remained in the sculptures and the texts, but not in the hearts of the people. The world moved forward, not in rebellion, but in forgetting. The Olympians, once mighty, became background. New gods came. They spoke of one truth, not many. They asked for faith, not sacrifice. They offered salvation, not spectacle. Christianity spread through the ancient world, not like fire, but like tide. Temples were emptied, then repurposed. The statues were beheaded or baptized. What was sacred became heretical. And yet the old gods did not rage. They did not rise in fury or beg for memory. They watched. Or perhaps they had already left, their essence bound now to stories, not skies. The myths remained because the stories were good, not because the gods demanded it. In time, the old myths became literature. They were read in schools, drawn by artists, whispered in dreams. Children no longer prayed to Athena before exams, but her wisdom still danced in the margins of pages. Poets invoked the muses not in temples, but in lamplit rooms. The gods had become metaphors, tools to understand the world, not to shape it. Ares became war, Demeter became harvest, Hades became death. No longer beings, they became ideas. But even ideas can echo with power, if only in quiet places. Some say the gods never left, that they sleep in hills or walk unnoticed through cities, forgotten but not gone, that Poseidon stirs in the anger of storms, and Hermes watches from crossroads, that Dionysus dances still wherever music drowns reason, that Hestia flickers in every hearth not yet gone cold. But they do not speak, or perhaps we no longer know how to listen. The divine voice has grown so faint that it is mistaken for wind, and yet in the silence, there is a kind of peace. The gods are no longer feared or obeyed. They are remembered, and remembrance is its own kind of immortality. The myths endure not because they are true, but because they are needed. They carry something older than fact, something human, love that destroys, pride that blinds, sacrifice, betrayal, longing, awe. They are mirrors polished by centuries, showing us not how the world is, but how it feels. That is why we return to them. Not to worship, but to understand. Not to believe, but to feel. And in that return, the gods breathe again, not as deities, but as stories. The kind of stories that whisper just before sleep, when the world is quiet enough to dream. So the end of mythology is not an ending at all. It is a transformation. Olympus has not fallen. It has faded. Its marble steps now sit beneath ivy. Its columns catch the last golden light. The gods, once so loud, now linger only in storybooks and stars. But perhaps that is enough. Perhaps they do not mourn their silence. Perhaps they understand what we, too, must learn. That to be remembered is sometimes greater than to be worshipped. That myths do not die. They rest.